Before the first light touched the narrow alleys of Fez, the tanner woke in the cool darkness of his small room. He did not rise hurriedly, nor did he look at the ceiling with anxious thoughts about the day ahead. His eyes opened to the familiar shadow of the wooden beam above his bed, and for a long while he simply lay there listening to the silence that filled the old city during the last hours of the night. The window was a small square cut into the thick earthen wall, and through it drifted the faint breath of an autumn morning that carried no dust from the street. A single wool blanket covered his body up to the chest, and the mattress beneath him was stuffed with dried palm fibers that had long ago molded to the shape of his shoulders and hips. The room held no other furniture except a low stool and a wooden chest, where he kept his clothes and the few belongings of a man who spent his days at the lime pits. Everything was still, as if the house itself had not yet drawn breath for the new day. Slowly, the tanner sat up and placed his bare feet on the cool stone floor. The sensation of the smooth flagstone under his soles was as familiar as the crack in the wall beside the door, a thin dark line that ran from the lintel to the ground and had not widened in all the years he had lived there. He reached for a clay cup that rested on the chest, filled it with water from a small earthen jar, and drank slowly while the rooster of a neighbor 2 streets away called once into the dark. The water was cool and tasted of the minerals deep under the city, a clean taste that reminded him of the lime pits in a distant way, though the pits smelled sharper and held no comfort for thirst. He did not eat, for the month of Ramadan had begun, and the fast would hold until the sun slipped behind the western hills. This was the time of suhoor, the pre-dawn meal, but the tanner had taken his portion earlier, a simple plate of bread and olives and a handful of dates, and now the quiet discipline of abstaining settled into his body like a second layer of clothing. He dressed in the darkness, pulling on the loose tunic of undyed wool that reached his knees, then a heavier outer robe with sleeves wide enough to roll up when he worked. The fabric smelled of lanolin and lime, a combination so embedded in the threads that no amount of washing could remove it. Around his waist he wrapped a long strip of cotton, and on his feet he placed soft leather slippers that he himself had made from the hide of a goat tanned 2 summers ago. They were worn thin at the heel and curved slightly upward at the toe, the leather darkened by months of walking the same route from home to tannery and back again. He moved without a candle, knowing the shape of the room and the position of the door by memory alone. His hand found the rough wood of the latch, lifted it without a sound, and stepped into the small courtyard that separated his sleeping quarters from the outer door. The courtyard was open to the sky, a rectangle of deep indigo scattered with stars that had not yet begun to fade. A single potted mint plant sat in one corner, its leaves drooping slightly from the lack of recent rain, and the stone basin for washing stood against the wall, already filled with water he had drawn the evening before. The tanner paused here to perform the ritual washing before the day's prayer, pouring the water over his hands and forearms, then his face, then his feet, the cool liquid running over his skin and dripping onto the flagstones in small dark splashes that the dry air would erase by mid-morning. He did not rush through the movements, allowing each rinse to take the time it required, his mind not occupied with any particular thought, merely present in the gentle repetition of an act performed thousands of times before. When the washing was complete, he lifted a small oil lamp from its niche in the wall. The lamp was made of brass, with a handle worn smooth and a wick that he trimmed with his thumbnail before lighting it with a spark from his flint. The flame caught and steadied, a small yellow teardrop that pushed the shadows back just far enough to reveal the wooden door that led to the street. He lifted the iron latch, pulled the door inward, and stepped outside. The alley was so narrow that a donkey with panniers could barely pass, its walls made of the same tawny earth as his own house, and the ground beneath his slippers was packed dirt strewn with stray bits of straw. Holding the lamp at waist height, the tanner began to walk. The flame cast a wobbling circle of light that moved ahead of him like a cautious companion, illuminating the uneven surface of the path and the lower edges of the walls. Above, the strip of sky visible between the overhanging upper stories was still thick with stars, though a faint pale line along the eastern horizon hinted at the coming day. The air moved slowly through the alley, a gentle current that was cool against his cheeks and carried the layered sense of a sleeping city. The dry smell of sun-baked earth, the faint sweetness of jasmine from a hidden courtyard, the lingering trace of charcoal fires extinguished the night before. He walked without haste, his steps short and measured, the soft leather of his slippers making only the slightest whisper against the ground. The lamp swung gently with the motion of his arm, and the shadows of doorways and window grills slid past in a slow procession. Most of the doors were closed, their heavy wooden faces studded with iron nails arranged in simple patterns, and the small windows set high in the walls were shuttered from within. The city was still asleep, wrapped in the deep silence of the last hours before dawn, a silence that felt thick and tangible, like a blanket laid over the rooftops. From somewhere far off, near the river perhaps, a dog barked once, a single hollow sound that rose and then dissolved without an echo, as if the very walls absorbed it. Then the silence returned, deeper than before. The tanner passed the entrance to a small square, where the date sellers set up their stalls, but now the space was empty, except for a few abandoned crates and the long shadow of a palm tree that stood in the center like a dark sentinel. The fronds of the palm rustled faintly in the breeze, a dry, papery sound that mingled with the soft pad of his footsteps. He did not look up at the tree, nor did he pause to examine the shuttered shops that lined the square. His gaze remained on the path ahead, the lamp guiding him past the blacksmith's forge with its cold anvil and the weaver's workshop with skeins of undyed wool hanging like ghosts from the awning. Every detail was known to him, every uneven stone and every stray cat that slept curled on a doorstep. A thin grey cat with a torn ear opened one eye as he passed, watched the light drift by, then tucked its head back into the warmth of its own fur. The alley widened slightly as he approached the great mosque, its minaret rising into the night like a slender finger pointing toward the heavens. The mosque was a place of profound quiet at this hour, its vast courtyard empty, the arched doorways dark and still. The tanner slowed his pace without thinking, not out of any deliberate reverence but from a habit of calm that the proximity of such a large and silent building naturally induced. The lamp illuminated the lower portion of the minaret's intricate tilework, geometric patterns in shades of deep blue and white that had been laid by craftsmen centuries before and remained as sharp and clear as the day they were fired. A small fountain in the center of the courtyard caught the lamplight for just a moment, its water perfectly still, reflecting a single star that had not yet faded. The tanner did not stop. He walked along the edge of the courtyard, his shadow stretching long and thin against the wall. And then he turned into a covered passage where the smell of old books and incense clung to the stonework, a remnant of the scholars who studied there during the day. Beyond the passage, the street opened onto the outskirts of the Medina, where the houses grew sparser and the ground began to slope gently downward toward the river valley. Here, the surface underfoot changed from packed earth to a rougher mixture of gravel and crushed limestone that made a faint crunching sound with each step. The tanner's lamp flickered in a sudden gust of air that funneled between two low buildings, but the flame held steady and he cupped his free hand around it for a moment until the breeze passed. The darkness ahead was less absolute now, the sky shifting from indigo to a soft grey that bled upward from the horizon like water seeping into fabric. The stars were retreating one by one as if pulled back into the vastness from which they came, and the outline of the hills to the east became visible as a low undulating line against the lightening sky. At the edge of the tannery grounds, a low wall of rough stones marked the boundary between the city's residential quarters and the working yards. The tanner stepped over a gap in the wall where a wooden gate had once hung, the hinges still protruding from the stone like rusted elbows, and entered the domain of his daily labor. The ground here was beaten flat by years of footsteps and the dragging of heavy hides, and the vegetation was sparse, a few tough tufts of grass and the occasional thistle that managed to survive in the lime-impregnated soil. A fig tree grew near the far wall, its wide leaves hanging motionless in the still air, and a pair of doves slept on a branch with their heads tucked under their wings, grey shapes barely distinguishable from the bark. Before him, arranged in neat rows like shallow mirrors, lay the lime pits. There were perhaps 20 of them, rectangular basins carved into the earth and lined with stone, each filled with a milky white liquid that seemed to glow faintly in the pre-dawn greyness. The hides soaked beneath the surface, their pale forms visible as darker masses that broke the uniformity of the lime water, some floating just under the surface, others resting deeper, suspended in the slow chemistry that loosened hair and softened sinew. A thin crust of lime had formed along the edges of the pits, a delicate white rime that crumbled at the slightest touch, and the smell that rose from the water was sharp and clean, a mineral tang that caught at the back of the throat and then settled into a familiar background note, as much a part of the tannery as the stones and the sky. The tanner walked to a small lean-to built against the outer wall, a simple shelter of reed mats stretched over a wooden frame, and placed his lamp on a flat stone that served as a shelf. The flame was no longer necessary, for the dawn had advanced enough that objects were visible in a muted palette of greys and pale blues, but he did not extinguish it yet. Instead, he stood at the edge of the first pit and looked down into the water. His own reflection stared back at him, a dark shape on the milky surface, featureless but recognizable as himself, a man of middle years with a lean face and hands that knew the weight of wet leather. He stayed there without moving, his arms hanging at his sides, his breathing slow and even, the cool air filling his lungs and leaving again without urgency. The distant city behind him remained silent, the fast unbroken, the day ahead a quiet succession of small tasks that would require no haste and no loudness. The doves in the fig tree shifted slightly, resettling their feathers, and the surface of the lime pit moved in a single slow ripple that travelled from one stone edge to the other, and then disappeared, leaving the water as still as before. The tanner remained at the edge of the first pit, his gaze resting on the pale surface of the lime water as the grey dawn slowly brought the yard into sharper relief. The liquid in the basin was not clear like drinking water, nor murky like the river after heavy rain. It possessed a dense, milky whiteness that seemed to hold the light rather than reflect it, a soft, luminous quality that made the shallow pool appear deeper than it truly was. Beneath that cloud of suspended lime, the submerged hides lay in dark, indistinct forms that shifted only when a faint vibration passed through the ground or when the tanner's own shadow fell across the stone rim. The hide nearest to him, a large cow skin that had been soaking for several days, floated just below the surface, its edges curled slightly upward, and its grain softened into a ghostly map of wrinkles and folds. Tiny bubbles of trapped air clung to the hair side of the leather, glistening like minuscule pearls, and here and there a loosened tuft of hair waved gently in some invisible current, detached from the follicle but not yet released into the water. The lime pits were arranged in two long rows that stretched across the flat yard, each basin rectangular and nearly identical to its neighbor, separated by low walls of stone and mortar that formed narrow walkways between them. The stones had been set by masons who worked generations before the tanner was born, their edges now rounded and crusted with years of dried lime that built up in uneven layers, a rough white patina that cracked into tiny fissures when the afternoon heat expanded the stone. Walking along the pathways required careful footwork, for the lime crust was slippery in places and the gaps between the stones could catch the toe of a slipper, though the tanner knew every step as intimately as a musician knows the frets of an oud. He had walked these same narrow ledges through every season, through the biting cold of winter mornings when the lime water gave off thin wisps of steam, and the fierce summer afternoons when the surface shimmered with heat and the smell of the pits grew heavier in the still air. Now, in the last hush of dawn, the yard held a quiet so complete that the tanner could hear the faint drip of water condensing on the reed awning of his shelter and falling to the packed earth below, a solitary sound that marked the slow passage of seconds. He drew a long breath through his nose and identified the layered scents of his workplace, the sharp, clean bite of the lime that caught at the back of the throat, the deeper animal odor of the soaking hides that was not unpleasant, but earthy and rich and frankly sweet, the cool mineral breath of the stones themselves. Mixed with these was the dry scent of the surrounding scrubland that crept over the low wall, a hint of sage and warm dust that reminded him the wider world existed beyond the tannery's quiet boundaries. The sky overhead had completed its slow transformation from indigo to a pale dove grey, and the stars had all withdrawn except for one bright point in the west that refused to fade, hanging just above the dark line of the hills. The fig tree near the wall emerged from the retreating night as a silhouette of broad leaves and twisted branches. The two grey doves still perched motionless on the same limb, their feathers ruffled slightly by a breeze that was not strong enough to reach the ground. That same breeze moved the topmost fronds of the distant palm trees in the city, and if the tanner turned his head just so, he could see the dark shapes of the minarets rising against the lightning sky, their edges growing sharper as the minutes passed. But he did not turn his head often. His attention remained on the pit before him, on the way the lime water's surface quivered almost imperceptibly in response to something unseen, perhaps a tiny movement of the hide settling deeper or a shift in the temperature of the air above it. The lime solution itself was a living thing, constantly changing in small ways as it worked upon the hides. When the hides had first been placed in the pits, they were stiff and covered with coarse hair, their flesh, sides still bearing traces of fat and membrane from the initial scraping. Over the days that followed, the alkaline bite of the lime began to loosen the hair at its roots, while simultaneously swelling the leather fibers, preparing the skin for the later stages of tanning. The tanner understood this process not as a set of chemical formulas, but as a slow rhythm embedded in his hands and his patience, a wisdom passed from master to apprentice over countless generations in this same city. He could read the progress of a hide by the way it floated, by the texture of the hair when he touched it, by the subtle change in the water's color that told him the lime was still active. His father had shown him these things when he was a boy, and now the knowledge lived in him as naturally as the beat of his heart. He moved to the second pit, walking along the narrow stone division with the ease of long practice, his slippers finding the stable places without conscious direction. The water in this basin was slightly clearer, for the hides within were fresher, placed in the lime only 2 days before, and the hair still clung tightly to the skins. A ram's hide floated near the edge, its wool a mass of dense grey curls that held tiny pockets of air and gave the submerged skin a ghostly, cloud-like appearance. The tanner crouched low, bending his knees until his face was only a hand's breadth from the surface, and looked at the hide without touching it. The wool swayed slowly, each individual fiber moving in a liquid dance that had no beginning and no end, a gentle oscillation that seemed to belong more to the world of seaweed and underwater plants than to the dry land of Fez. A single strand of wool detached itself as he watched, rising through the milky water until it reached the surface where it lay still, a tiny curve of grey on a field of white. The crouching position placed a gentle strain on his thighs, and he welcomed the feeling, a reminder that his body was awake and engaged in the simple act of looking. After a long moment, he straightened and continued his slow circuit of the yard, passing by the third pit where a stack of goat skins were layered one on top of another, like pale, discarded garments, their thin edges overlapping and their shapes distorted by the water's refraction. The fourth pit held only one large hide, that of an ox that had been brought down from the northern plains, and its immense size spanned almost the entire width of the basin, the dark outline of its back and haunches clearly visible beneath the lime. This hide still held patches of hair that the lime had not yet conquered, dark swirls against the lighter background of the swollen skin, and the tanner made a mental note to return to it later for extra attention, a thought that registered without any sense of urgency, simply a marker placed in the quiet flow of his morning. At the far end of the yard, where the pits gave way to a bare patch of ground used for spreading hides in the sun, the low stone wall stood as a boundary between the working world and the empty scrubland beyond. The tanner stopped there and placed one hand on the rough warmth of the wall, feeling the coolness of the night still lingering in the stone despite the gradual arrival of the day's first warm breath. The view from this spot was open and uncluttered, a slope of pale earth dotted with thorny shrubs, then the dry riverbed that would only fill with the winter rains, then the foothills rising in overlapping ridges that faded from brown to blue in the morning haze. A pair of storks were flying low over the riverbed, their long legs trailing behind them like ribbons, their wings beating with a slow, unhurried rhythm that matched the pace of the tanner's own heartbeat. He watched them until they disappeared behind the shoulder of the nearest hill. Then he turned back to face the pits. The light had strengthened now, shifting from grey to a soft amber that picked out the worn tones in the stone walls and made the lime water glow with a pearlescent sheen. The crust of dried lime along the rims of the pits sparkled faintly where tiny crystals caught the low-angled rays, and the shadows cast by the reed awning stretched long and black across the ground, sharp-edged and distorted. The doves in the fig tree had woken fully. One was preening its chest feathers with quick, neat movements of its beak, while the other surveyed the yard with a round, unblinking eye. From the city, the first sounds of the waking day began to carry on the still air, the distant crow of a rooster that was answered by another, further away, the clatter of a wooden shutter being opened, the faint call of a water seller arranging his goatskin bags. These sounds were thin and far, like music heard through a closed door, and they did not disturb the deep quiet that wrapped the tannery. They simply added another layer to the morning, a gentle announcement that the world was stirring, but had no claim on this solitary yard. The tanner returned to the first pit and knelt beside it, placing his palm flat on the cool stone rim. The surface of the lime water was now perfectly still again, a smooth plate of opaque white that reflected the pale sky and the thin crescent of the old moon that still hung in the western quadrant. Looking into it was like looking into a dish filled with milk, a field of possibility where nothing moved and nothing needed to move. He could see the faint outline of his own head and shoulders reflected as a dark smudge against the brightness, and he could see the deeper shadow of the cowhide that waited beneath, silent and patient. The tanner's breathing slowed to match the rhythm of the water, a quiet in and out that barely stirred the air in front of his lips. The fast of Ramadan sat lightly in his stomach, a mild hollow sensation that felt clean and sharp, and his thirst was still a distant thing, not yet pressing, but present, a quiet companion that would stay with him until sunset. He dipped the tip of one finger into the lime water, disturbing the surface with a small, slow ripple that spread outward in perfect circles until it reached the stone edges and dissolved. The water was cool against his skin, cooler than the morning air, and it left a faint white residue on his fingertip when he withdrew it, a fine coating of lime that dried almost instantly into a powdery film. He rubbed the residue between his thumb and forefinger, feeling the slight grittiness of the lime particles, then wiped his hand on the front of his tunic, where a pale patch of similar stains already marked the fabric. This small gesture was one he performed many times each day, a reflex so ingrained that it required no thought, like a baker brushing flour from his apron, or a scribe wiping the nib of his reed pen. The sun had not yet cleared the eastern hills, but the sky above them was brightening into bands of golden rose that promised its imminent arrival. A flock of small brown birds flew over the yard in a tight, chattering group, their wings beating rapidly and their shadows flickering across the lime pits like a handful of tossed pebbles. They were gone as quickly as they had appeared, and the silence they left behind seemed even deeper by contrast, a silence that hummed very faintly with the distant industry of bees visiting the wild thyme that grew in the cracks of the stone wall. The tanner noticed the bees without watching them, aware of their presence as a low, steady drone that merged with the rustle of the fig leaves and the soft, continuous whisper of the lime pits breathing their mineral scent into the air. He settled himself on a flat stone that served as a seat near the shelter and rested his hands on his knees, palms facing upward in a posture of open stillness. The day was spreading itself over the tannery like a slow tide, and the hides continued their silent transformation in the milky baths, unhurried, uncomplaining. Nothing more needed to happen in this chapter of the morning. The inspection could wait, the turning of the hides could wait, the scraping and the lifting could wait. For now it was enough to sit at the edge of the pits and watch the light grow, to feel the cool air begin its slow retreat, and the heat of the ground begin its slow advance, to be a man alone in a yard of stone and water and leather, fasting in the holy month, waiting for the day to reveal what it would. The lime pits held their secrets beneath the white veil, and the tanner held his peace above it, and the balance between them was as steady as the rotation of the earth that brought the sun closer with every breath. The tanner rose from the flat stone where he had been sitting, his knees making a faint popping sound that was swallowed by the open air of the yard. He walked to the corner of the shelter where his tools rested against the rough wall, several wooden poles of different lengths, a collection of blunt scrapers with handles darkened by moisture, a coil of rope made from palm fiber, and a small clay pot filled with a paste of lime and ash that he used for spot treatments on stubborn patches of hair. The poles leaned together like a bundle of thin spears, their ends resting in a groove worn into the stone floor over the years, a groove that fit each pole perfectly and held them upright even when the wind blew. He selected the longest of the poles, a shaft of cedar wood that reached from the ground to his shoulder, its surface smoothed by countless grip and release motions until it gleamed faintly in the morning light like polished bone. The wood was cool and dry against his palm, and its weight was balanced just slightly toward the thicker end, a characteristic that helped the tip descend into the lime water with gentle precision rather than an abrupt splash. He carried the pole horizontally at his waist, the way a fisherman carries a rod when wading into a quiet stream, and approached the first pit where the cowhide had been soaking near the surface. The morning sun had now cleared the eastern hills, sending long golden rays across the yard that turned the lime pits into rectangles of soft white light, bordered by the dark stone dividers. The air was beginning to warm, the coolness of night retreating into the shadows under the reed awning and into the crevices of the wall, but the direct heat of the day had not yet arrived. It was that brief interval when the temperature hung in perfect balance, neither too cool nor too warm, and the tanner's body registered this balance as a kind of physical contentment, a comfort that made the work ahead feel less like labor and more like the continuation of a natural rhythm. He positioned himself at the head of the first pit, planting his feet on two stable stones that he knew would not shift under his weight. The lime water before him was still, its surface undisturbed since he had dipped his finger into it earlier, and the cowhide beneath was a dark shape suspended in the whiteness, its edges visible as faint undulating lines. The tanner lowered the tip of the pole into the liquid, doing so at an angle that allowed the wood to slide through the surface with minimal disturbance, creating only a small circular ripple that expanded once and then disappeared. The pole descended through the milky water, its outline growing hazy and distorted as it went deeper, until the tip made contact with the hide. He felt the resistance through the wood, a soft, spongy give that transmitted itself up the shaft and into his hands as a muted pressure, the sensation of touching something solid but yielding, something that was no longer raw skin but not yet finished leather. He adjusted his grip on the pole, sliding his top hand down a hand's breadth, while his lower hand remained fixed near the base, and began the slow process of nudging the hide toward him. The movement was not a push or a shove, but a coaxing, a steady, patient pressure that encouraged the heavy skin to drift toward the near edge of the pit. The hide obeyed slowly, its great mass shifting through the lime water with a ponderous grace, creating a subtle current that disturbed the milky surface in slow, lazy swirls. As it moved closer, the details of its condition became visible, patches where the hair had already released, leaving bare, swollen grain that was pale and smooth, areas where the hair still clung in dark, sodden clumps that would need more time, or perhaps a direct application of the lime paste, and along the edges, the places where the tanner's earlier scrapings had thinned the hide, creating translucent margins that glowed amber when the sunlight caught them. The tanner maneuvered the pole until its tip was positioned beneath the nearest corner of the hide, then he lifted gently, using the leverage of the stone rim as a fulcrum. The corner rose from the water, breaking the surface with a soft, wet sound, and the lime solution drained off in thin white rivulets that ran back into the pit like milk poured in slow motion. The exposed portion of hide gleamed in the sunlight, its surface slick and glistening, its texture reminiscent of a soaked sponge that had been compressed and then allowed to expand. Droplets of lime water clung to the grain in tiny beads that caught the light and refracted it into miniature rainbows, and the hair that remained on this section was loose enough that a gentle tug from the tanner's fingers, had he chosen to touch it, would have pulled it away in a wet clump. He did not touch it. He simply held the corner above the water, observing the way it dripped, the way the light revealed the fine network of capillaries that had once carried blood through the living animal and now lay dormant, cleansed and swollen and waiting. The weight of the hide was substantial, a dead weight made heavier by the water it had absorbed, and the pole bowed slightly under the strain. The tanner's arms remained steady, his shoulders braced in a posture of easy strength that came from years of performing this exact motion. He counted his breaths without numbering them, letting the slow rhythm of inhalation and exhalation provide a kind of internal metronome for the work. After a long moment of inspection, during which his eyes traveled methodically across every visible inch of the lifted corner, he lowered the pole with the same deliberate slowness, allowing the hide to slide back into the pit without a splash. The lime water closed over it, and the surface, after a brief wobble, settled back into stillness. He withdrew the pole, letting the excess liquid drain from the tip, and moved along the stone divider to the next pit where the ram's hide floated with its dense grey wool. Here the process began again, identical in its broad strokes but endlessly variable in its small details. The ram's hide was lighter than the cow hide, a smaller skin that had come from a younger animal, and the pole met its surface with a different quality of resistance, less spongy, more elastic, like pressing a fingertip against a tautly stretched drumhead. The wool was a thick, waterlogged mass that swayed independently of the hide itself, a separate entity that moved with its own liquid logic. When the tanner nudged this hide, the wool trails behind it like a cloud of grey smoke, each strand twisting and coiling in the disturbed water. He lifted a section near what had been the animal's flank, and the wool hung down in long, dripping ropes that swung gently back and forth before the water's surface tension reclaimed them. The inspection of the ram's hide revealed progress that pleased the tanner in a quiet, unspoken way. The lime had done its work well. The wool was loosening evenly across the entire skin, and when he ran the pole lightly over the surface, small tufts detached and floated upward, gathering in the corners of the pit like dirty foam. The smell that rose from this basin was slightly different from the others, a touch more ammoniacal, a sharper note that indicated the chemical process was active and healthy. The tanner noted this with a single slow blink, the closest he came to an expression of satisfaction. Then he lowered the hide and moved on. The third pit contained a stack of goat skins, perhaps 7 or 8 of them layered one atop another in a pale, submerged pile. These were small, delicate skins that required a gentler touch, and the tanner adjusted his grip on the pole accordingly, holding it higher up the shaft to give himself more control and less leverage. He worked the tip of the pole between the layers, gently separating them, feeling the faint tremor as each skin released from its neighbor with a soft, sucking reluctance. The goat skins were thin to begin with, and the lime had swollen their fibers until they were almost translucent along the edges, each skin a ghost of its former shape. The hair on these was short and fine, and it had released so completely that the surfaces were mostly bare, showing the distinctive grain pattern that would later be prized by leatherworkers making fine slippers and bookbindings and the delicate pouches that women used to hold coal and perfume. The tanner lifted each of the 7 skins in turn, holding them briefly above the water, just long enough to confirm that the hair removal was uniform and that no patches of epidermis remained stubbornly attached. Then he restacked them with care, ensuring that they lay flat and would not fold or crease in ways that might create uneven tanning. By the time he reached the 4th pit, where the large ox hide lay spanning almost the entire width of the basin, the sun had risen high enough to shorten the shadows and bring a perceptible warmth to the back of his neck. The ox hide was a formidable piece of leather, thick and heavy, and still bearing the stubborn patches of dark hair that he had noted during his earlier walk-through. These patches were concentrated along the spine area where the animal's hide had been thickest and most resistant to the lime's penetration. The tanner spent a longer time at this pit, leveraging the pole under the massive hide and rolling it slightly, exposing the underside where the flesh had been scraped clean of fat and membrane. The flesh side of the ox hide was a uniform pale cream color, smooth and even, absorbing the lime water at a slower rate than the grain side, and the tanner pressed the pole gently against this surface, feeling the firmness that told him the hide was still several days away from being ready for the next stage. He would need to add more lime to this pit perhaps, or give the stubborn patches a direct application of the paste from his clay pot. He filed this information away without any sense of urgency, a quiet acknowledgement that the hide, like all things, would yield in its own time. After the ox hide, there were still many pits to inspect. The tanner worked his way down the first row and then up the second, a slow meandering path that took him past basins containing skins of sheep and camel and more cows, some fresh and newly submerged, others that had been soaking for so long that the lime water had thickened into a slurry that clung to the pole like thin porridge. Each hide was nudged with the cedarwood pole, each was observed with the same patient attention, each was allowed its moment in the morning sun before being returned to its alkaline bath. The rhythm of the work was hypnotic, the soft splash as the pole entered the water, the muted thud of contact, the gentle lift that brought the hide into the light, the inspection, the lowering and then the step sideways to the next pit, where the sequence repeated with variations so subtle that only the tanner could perceive them. During one of these lifts, a small incident occurred that was so unremarkable it barely registered as an event. A sheepskin that had been soaking for the optimal number of days released the last of its wool in a single sudden mass. the entire fleece detaching from the grain and floating to the surface like a pale, shaggy island. The tanner watched it rise without surprise, then used the tip of his pole to guide it to the edge of the pit, where he scooped it out and deposited it on the stone walkway. The wet wool made a soft slapping sound as it landed, and a thin trickle of lime water ran from it into the cracks between the stones. The tanner would collect it later and give it to the wool merchants who used such waste for stuffing cushions and saddle pads. For now it lay in a soggy heap, steaming faintly in the warming air, and the tanner returned his attention to the sheepskin that was now bare and smooth, ready for the next phase. The sun continued its slow climb, and the tanner's shadow shortened until it was a dark pool around his feet rather than a long figure stretching across the yard. The thirst that had been a distant companion in the early morning grew more insistent, a dry tightness at the back of his throat that reminded him of the fast with every swallow. He did not fight the thirst or lament it. He acknowledged it, as he acknowledged the position of the sun and the weight of the pole and the smell of the lime. It was simply a part of the day, a condition of the holy month, a shared experience with every other fasting soul in the city behind him. The thought of water was a cool, abstract thing, something he would have in the evening when the sun set, and he held it in his mind without yearning, like a promise that would keep itself. His arms began to feel the cumulative effort of the inspection, a mild fatigue that settled into his shoulders and forearms as a dull, warm ache. He paused between two pits, resting the butt of the pole on the ground while he rolled his shoulders in slow circles, loosening the muscles that had been holding the same tension for over an hour. A bead of sweat traced a path from his temple down the side of his face, leaving a cool trail on his skin, and he wiped it away with the sleeve of his tunic, the fabric rough and dry against his cheek. The doves in the fig tree had departed on some private errand of their own, leaving the branches empty, and a single butterfly with pale yellow wings fluttered erratically over the lime pits, searching for something that was not there. It spiraled upward until it was a tiny speck against the blue. Then it drifted away over the wall and was gone. The final pits in the second row held hides that were nearly finished with their lime soaking, their hair completely dissolved into a gelatinous sludge that coated the bottom of the basins, their skin swollen and pliable and ready for the beam house, where they would be scraped and cleaned and prepared for the actual tanning liquors. The tanner lifted these with particular gentleness, for the swollen hides were delicate and could tear if handled roughly. He used the pole more as a support than a lever, sliding it under the floating skins and raising them just enough to break the surface tension, then letting the water drain away while he examined the grain for any remaining imperfections. These hides had the pale, almost translucent quality of properly limed leather, and when he held one up to the light that filtered through the reed awning, he could see the faint outline of the animal's vein network, a ghostly map of life that would gradually fade as the tanning progressed. When the last hide had been inspected and lowered back into its pit, the tanner straightened and placed the cedarwood pole back in its groove against the shelter wall. The ritual was complete, a full circuit of the tannery that had taken the better part of 2 hours and had covered every soaking skin in the yard. The lime water in each pit had been disturbed and was now slowly settling, the particles of lime that had been stirred up by the pole's movements drifting back down through the liquid in invisible curtains of white. The hides rested in their baths, their positions slightly adjusted from their original placements, their surfaces glistening in the filtered light, their transformation continuing at the slow pace that leather demands. The tanner stood in the center of the yard, his hands resting on the small of his back, his eyes moving over the rows of pits with the quiet satisfaction of a worker who has completed a necessary task without hurry or error. The day was still young, the sun still climbing, the fast still holding, and the tannery hummed with the silent industry of chemistry and time. The tanner remained standing in the center of the yard for a long while after the inspection was done, his hands loosely clasped behind his back, and his weight settled evenly on both feet. The morning had advanced past its earliest hours into a stretch of time that felt suspended, a quiet plateau between the activity of dawn and the slow approach of midday. The sun was now fully above the hills, a warm gold disk that had burned off the last traces of grey in the sky and replaced them with a clean, pale blue that stretched unbroken from horizon to horizon. The light fell across the tannery in broad, uninterrupted planes, illuminating the lime pits so that each basin glowed like a flat white tile set into the darker earth, and the shadows that remained were short and dense, huddled close to the bases of the walls and the legs of the reed shelter. In this light, the yard revealed textures that the dimness of early morning had concealed. The fine cracks in the stone dividers, where tiny crystals of dried lime sparkled. The rough grain of the cedarwood pole that rested against the shelter wall. The tiny pot marks in the beaten earth, where drops of lime water had fallen and dried over the course of years. The tanner's senses, freed from the focus required by the inspection, now opened outward to the full atmosphere of the place, beginning with the smells that rose from every surface. The scent of the tannery was not a single note, but a complex chord that shifted subtly, depending on where one stood and which way the breeze was blowing. At the center of the yard, where he now stood, the dominant smell was the lime itself, a clean, sharp, almost metallic odor that seemed to scrape the inside of the nostrils very lightly with each inhalation. It was not an unpleasant smell, merely a strong one, and the tanner had long ago ceased to notice it as anything other than the baseline of his working life. The lime smell had a cold quality to it, even on warm days. A mineral austerity that reminded him of the deep wells outside the city walls where the water tasted of stone, and it mingled with a warmer, earthier scent of the wet hides so thoroughly that the two could not be completely separated, only distinguished in the way that one might distinguish the voice of a single singer within a choir. Beneath the lime, the hides contributed their own rich aroma, a dense animal smell that varied from pit to pit depending on the type of skin and the length of its soaking. The cow hides in the first pit gave off a heavy, sweetish scent that was almost dairy-like, a faint reminder of the barns where the animals had once lived, while the ram's hide in the second pit carried a sharper, woollier note, the smell of lanolin breaking down in the alkaline solution. The goat skins in the third pit had a milder, cleaner scent, almost neutral, like wet paper or the pages of a very old book, and the ox hide in the fourth pit smelled darker and muskier, a deep animal odor that seemed to vibrate at a lower frequency than the others. Together these smells formed a layered perfume that hung over the yard like a low, invisible fog, too heavy to rise but too light to settle completely, shifting in slow eddies whenever the air moved. The tanner breathed it in without thought, his lungs accepting the mixture as readily as they accepted the pure air of the hills, for this smell was the smell of his life, and had been for as long as he could remember. There were other smells too, smaller and more intermittent, that drifted across the yard in the gentle currents of the morning. When the breeze came from the direction of the scrubland, it brought the dry, herbaceous scent of wild thyme and the faint, dusty perfume of sun-warmed rock. A clean outdoor smell that cut through the heavier tannery odors for a moment before dissolving into them. When the breeze shifted and came instead from the city, it carried the distant fragrance of wood smoke from the bakery ovens, a thin, acrid note that was oddly comforting because it spoke of bread and meals and the ordinary life of the streets that would resume after the fast was broken. And once, very briefly, the wind brought a trace of something floral, perhaps jasmine from a hidden courtyard garden, a scent so delicate that the tanner was not entirely sure he had smelled it at all, a suggestion rather than a fact that passed through his awareness and was gone before he could turn his head. He did not chase the smell or wonder about its source. He simply let it come and let it go, as he did with all the fleeting sensations of the day. The sounds of the tannery were as layered as its smells, and the tanner now turned his attention to them with the same passive receptivity. The loudest and most continuous sound was the slow dripping of water from the lifted hides earlier, a sound that persisted long after the hides had been returned to their pits, because the lime solution continued to drain from the stone edges and the wooden pole and the small heap of wool that lay on the walkway. Each drip fell with a soft, percussive plink, the sound varying slightly depending on whether the drop hit stone or packed earth or the surface of a pit, and the combined effect of all these drips was a gentle arrhythmic music that filled the yard like the ticking of many unsynchronized clocks. The drips were slowing now as the surfaces dried, the intervals between them growing longer and longer, and soon they would stop altogether. But for now they continued, a fading reminder of the work that had been done. Beyond the dripping, the tannery produced its own subtle noises, the small sounds of a place that was not truly silent, even when no one moved. The lime pits themselves made a faint sound if one listened closely, a very low, very soft fizzing that came from the chemical reaction still taking place within the water. Millions of tiny bubbles of gas being released from the hides as the lime continued its slow work of breaking down the hair and swelling the fibers. This sound was so quiet that it existed at the very edge of hearing, a smooth, continuous whisper that was more a sensation than a noise, like the sound of the sea, heard from a great distance, or the rustle of dry leaves stirred by an unfelt wind. The tanner did not consciously register this sound, but his body knew it, and its absence would have been jarring, a wrongness that signaled something had gone amiss with the chemistry of the pits. From the fig tree near the wall came the sporadic chirping of small birds that had arrived after the doves departed. These were sparrows, a flock of perhaps a dozen, small brown birds with quick, jerky movements that flitted from branch to branch and occasionally dropped down to the ground to peck at the crumbs of lime crust that might contain tiny insects. Their chirps were high and sharp, little bursts of sound that overlapped and interrupted each other in a constant, chattering conversation that had no discernible beginning or end. The sparrows had no fear of the tanner, for he never disturbed them, and they went about their small business in the fig tree, as if he was simply another feature of the landscape, a stationary object like the stone wall or the reed shelter. Occasionally, one of the sparrows would fly across the yard in a swift, straight line, its wings beating so rapidly that they blurred, and it would perch on the rim of a lime pit for a few seconds, tilting its head to look at the white surface with one bright black eye before flying back to the tree. The city beyond the tannery wall was fully awake now, and its sounds drifted over the open ground in a constant murmuring undercurrent that was never loud enough to be distracting, but never entirely absent. The mezzan had long since finished the dawn call to prayer, and the voices that rose from the streets now were the secular sounds of daily commerce and movement, the distant braying of a donkey, the rhythmic clang of the blacksmith's hammer striking iron, the higher, sharper ring of the coppersmith's hammer on the tray, the calls of the water sellers and the fruit vendors, and the men who sold charcoal from heavy baskets. These sounds reached the tannery softened by distance, their edges blurred so that they blended together into a kind of sonic soup, a warm human hum that was the background noise of a living city. The tanner could distinguish individual sounds if he focused on them, but he did not focus. He let the hum wash over him like the breeze, a familiar presence that required no response. Closer at hand, there were other sounds that came from the tannery's immediate surroundings rather than the distant streets. A pair of crows had landed on the far wall and were pacing back and forth along its top with the self-important gait of officials inspecting a property, their claws making faint scratching sounds on the stones, and their harsh caws occasionally cutting through the softer noises like black slashes on a pale canvas. The tanner glanced at them without moving his head, a slight shift of his eyes that acknowledged their presence. Then he returned his gaze to the middle distance. The crows were regular visitors drawn by the faint odor of animal matter, though they rarely found anything edible in the lime pits themselves and usually departed after a thorough survey. Today they stayed longer than usual, perhaps because the heap of discarded wool on the walkway interested them, and one of them hopped down to investigate, its blue-black head cocked to the skeptical angle. After a few tentative pecks at the lime-soaked wall, it decided the prize was not worth the effort and flew back to the wall with a disgruntled flap of its wings. The tanner's own body contributed its sounds to the quiet symphony of the morning. His breathing was slow and steady, a soft in and out that was audible only to himself, and when he shifted his weight from one foot to the other, the leather of his slippers made a faint whisper against the packed earth. His stomach, empty since the pre-dawn meal, produced a low, hollow rumble that came and went without pain, a gentle reminder of the fast that he acknowledged and then ignored. The thirst that had been growing since early morning was now a constant, dry presence at the back of his mouth, and when he swallowed, the sound was unusually loud in his own ears, a small click and a soft contraction of the throat that momentarily blocked out the other noises. He thought about the jar of water that sat in the shade of the shelter, the clay jar with its porous sides that kept the water cool through evaporation, and the thought was almost soothing, a promise of relief that he did not need to fulfill for many hours yet. The breeze that had been shifting and wandering all morning now settled into a steady, gentle flow from the west, moving across the yard with the speed of a slow walk and carrying with it the full combined scent of the tannery toward the city. As it passed the shelter, It rustled the reed mats that formed the awning, a dry, papery sound that was one of the tanner's favorite noises, a sound that reminded him of the palm groves on the far side of the river where the reeds were harvested. The reeds clicked against each other lightly, their hollow stems producing a range of soft, woody tones that were almost musical, and the ropes that tied the mats to the wooden frame creaked faintly as the structure adjusted to the pressure of the wind. The shelter had been built by the tanner's own hands many years ago, and it had settled into its position so thoroughly that it seemed to have grown from the ground rather than being constructed. Its posts sunk deep, and its roof shaped by sun and rain into a gentle, uneven curve. The sound of the reeds was a sound of home, a sound that told him he was where he was supposed to be. A lizard emerged from a crack in the stone wall near the shelter and paused to bask in the sun, its tiny body pressed flat against the warm stone, its tail trailing behind it like a thin, grey cord. The tanner noticed the lizard without looking directly at it, aware of its presence as a small, still shape at the edge of his vision. The lizard's throat pulsed rapidly, a sign that it was cooling itself in the heat that was beginning to intensify, and its eyes, black and unblinking, surveyed the yard with the patience of a creature that had nowhere to go and nothing to do. It stayed there for perhaps 10 minutes, absorbing the warmth, then it darted back into its crack, with a sudden, fluid motion that was over almost before it began. The sound of its movement was too quick to be heard, a whisper of scale on stone that vanished into the general quiet. The tanner walked slowly to the shelter, his steps unhurried, and sat down on the flat stone that served as his seat. The shade of the reed awning fell across his shoulders and head, a welcome coolness after the direct sun of the yard, and he leaned back against the rough wall, feeling the solidness of the stone against his spine. From this position, his view of the lime pits was slightly different, framed by the edge of the awning and the trunk of the fig tree, and the light that reached him was filtered through the reeds into a soft, greenish amber glow. He could see the surface of the nearest pit shimmering faintly as the breeze dimpled the lime water with tiny ripples that moved from one side to the other in slow, parallel lines. And he could see the dark shapes of the hides beneath, patient and still, their transformation continuing at the pace that chemistry and time dictated. The combined effect of all these sensory inputs, the smells and the sounds and the gentle play of light and shadow, was a kind of drowsiness, not the heaviness of sleep, but a lighter, more transparent state in which the boundaries between awareness and dreaming seemed to thin. The tanner did not fight this feeling, he allowed it to settle over him like a second blanket, his eyes half closing and his breathing deepening by a fraction. The fast made everything slightly unreal, slightly distant, as if he were observing his own life from a few inches outside his body, and this sensation was not unpleasant. It made the hours pass more softly, smoothing the edges of the waiting that filled the spaces between tasks. He knew that the afternoon would bring more work, the turning of the hides and perhaps some scraping of the ones that were nearly finished, but for now there was nothing that demanded his attention, and the tannery functioned perfectly well without his active intervention. The sparrows in the fig tree fell silent for a moment, then resumed their chattering with renewed energy, and the crows on the wall finally departed, flapping heavily away toward the river. The distant sounds of the city continued their steady murmur, punctuated now by the noon call to prayer that floated over the rooftops, the muezzin's voice a long, wavering ribbon of sound that rose and fell in patterns that were as familiar as the shape of the hills. The tanner did not rise for the prayer yet. He would pray in a short while, when the sun reached its zenith. But for now he remained seated, listening to the lime pits fizz very softly in their basins, feeling the warm air move across his skin, smelling the warm air move across his skin, smelling the layered history of leather and stone and dry earth. The tannery held him in its quiet embrace, and he asked nothing more of the morning than what it was already giving, a calm, slow progression of moments that required no speech and no decision and no haste. Only the simple act of being present in a place that had measured time in the soaking of hides for longer than any living memory could reach. The tanner sat in the shade of the reed shelter for a time that was measured not by any clock, but by the slow movement of the sun across the lime pits, a movement so gradual that it could only be perceived by the shifting angle of the shadows against the stone dividers. His back rested against the rough wall, and his hands lay open on his thighs, palms turned upward in a posture of rest that was also a posture of receiving, as if he were letting the quiet of the yard flow into him through his skin. The fast had settled into a steady background presence now, a hollow feeling in his stomach that was no longer new or distracting, but simply there, part of the fabric of the day, and his thirst was a constant dryness that he had accepted as fully as he accepted the warmth of the air and the weight of his own limbs. After a long while, he lifted his hands from his thighs and held them in front of his face, turning them slowly in the filtered light that came through the reed awning, examining them as he might examine a tool that had been in his possession for many years and whose every scratch and callus he knew by heart. The hands of the tanner were not the hands of a young man, though they still held their strength in the thick muscles of the palms and the firm grip of the fingers. The skin was browned by sun and stained in places with a faint greyish patina that no amount of washing could remove, a permanent record of the lime that had soaked into the creases over decades of work. The fingertips were broad and slightly flattened, the nails trimmed short and rimmed with a thin line of pale residue, and the knuckles were prominent, the joints having thickened over the years from the constant gripping of poles and scrapers and the heavy wet weight of hides being lifted from the pits. Across the palms ran calluses that had formed in specific patterns, a map of his trade written in hardened skin, the long curved callus at the base of the fingers where the pole rested during lifting, the rounder callus on the heel of the hand from pushing the blunt scraper, the small tough spot on the inside of the thumb where he tested the edge of his tools. These calluses were not painful or even sensitive. They were like a second layer of leather that had grown over his own flesh, a protective covering that made his hands into the perfect instruments for the work they performed. He lowered his left hand and kept the right one suspended, studying the fine lines of dried lime that traced the pattern of his skin like the lines of a river delta seen from a great height. The lime worked its way into every crevice, and at the end of each day he would wash his hands in the fresh water of the clay jar and rub them with a little olive oil to keep the skin from cracking. But some traces always remained. The lime was a patient substance, more patient even than the tanner himself, and it had been accumulating in the microscopic furrows of his fingerprints for so long that he sometimes thought it had become part of him, a mineral deposit in the geology of his body. He did not mind this, it was the mark of his craft, as the calluses were the mark of his craft, and he bore them without pride or shame, simply as facts of his existence. After a moment, he lowered his hand and rose from the flat stone, moving with the slight stiffness that came from sitting still for too long. He walked to the corner of the shelter, where his tools waited, and there he crouched down, his knees bending easily, now that they were warm, and he began to examine each tool in turn with the same methodical attention he had given to the hides earlier. The tools were not many, for tanning was a craft that required patience more than equipment, and each piece had been chosen or made for a specific purpose and had served that purpose without complaint for years. The tanner's relationship with his tools was intimate and wordless, a quiet understanding that required no explanation. He knew the weight of each scraper, the balance of each pole, the way the rope coiled and uncoiled, and the tools knew the grip of his hands and the particular motions he demanded of them. The first tool he picked up was a blunt scraper, an implement consisting of a curved iron blade set into a thick wooden handle that had been carved from a piece of olive wood. The blade was not sharp in the way that a knife was sharp. Its edge was rounded and smooth, designed to push and separate rather than cut, and its surface was dark with a patina of age that gave it the blue-grey color of a storm cloud. The tanner turned the scraper over in his hands, feeling its heft, the way the weight settled into his palm, and he ran his thumb along the curve of the blade to check for any nicks or irregularities that might have developed since the last use. The metal was smooth and cool, and the edge was as even as it had been the day before and the day before that, for the scraper was a well-made tool that had been forged by a smith in the old quarter who understood the needs of the tanneries. The wooden handle was dark with moisture and worn to a polish where the tanner's grip had compressed the wood fibers over countless repetitions, and there was a small crack near the base that had been there for years without growing, a familiar imperfection that he accepted as part of the tool's character. He set the scraper aside and reached for a smaller tool, a hand scraper that he used for the finer work on goat skins and the delicate areas around the edges of the larger hides. This one had a shorter handle made of bone, the leg bone of a sheep that had been smoothed and shaped until it fit the hand like a river stone, and its blade was thinner and more flexible than the larger scraper, made of a lighter iron that could follow the contours of a hide without gouging. The bone handle had yellowed with age and had developed a network of tiny surface cracks that looked like the crazing on old pottery, and the tanner rubbed it absently with his thumb while he inspected the blade. A small amount of dried lime had crusted along the join where the metal met the bone, and he picked it off with his fingernail, the crust flaking away in tiny white chips that fell to the packed earth and disappeared. The hand scraper was an old friend, perhaps the oldest tool he owned, having been passed down from his father, who had received it from his father in turn, and the bone handle held the warmth of his hand almost immediately, as if it remembered him. Next to the scrapers lay the clay pot of lime paste that he had noted earlier during the inspection of the ox hide. The pot was a simple vessel, unglazed and porous, its rim chipped in 2 places and its sides stained with the white residue of its contents. A piece of coarse linen was tied over the top with a twist of palm fiber to keep the paste from drying out, and the tanner untied the string and lifted the cloth to check the consistency of the mixture inside. The paste was a thick, chalky substance made from lime that had been slaked with just enough water to form a spreadable compound, and it smelled sharper and more concentrated than the lime water in the pits. The tanner stirred it with a short stick that rested inside the pot, feeling the resistance of the thick paste against the wood, and decided that it was still moist enough for use on the stubborn patches of the ox hide. He retied the cloth and set the pot back in its place, near the front of the tool collection where he could reach it easily when the time came. The poles were next, and he ran his hand along the length of each one, checking for splinters or cracks that might catch on the hides. The cedarwood pole that he had used for the inspection was still damp from the lime water, and he wiped it down with a dry rag that hung from a peg on the shelter post, drawing the cloth along the wood in long, even strokes that removed the moisture and left the surface smooth and ready. The second pole was shorter and thicker, made of oak rather than cedar, and it was used for the heavier hides that required more leverage. Its end was blunt and rounded, almost club-like, and the wood had darkened to a deep brown from years of immersion. The third pole was the shortest of all, little more than a sturdy stick with a flattened tip, and it was reserved for the small goat skins that needed a delicate touch. Each pole had its own personality, its own way of responding to the tanner's hands, and he cared for them with a fussiness that he did not extend to his own body, wiping them dry and storing them upright where the air could circulate and prevent the growth of mold. The rope of palm fiber was coiled in a neat figure 8 beside the poles, its strands twisted together into a cord that was slightly thicker than the tanner's thumb and roughly as long as 3 men lying head to foot. This rope was used for moving the heaviest hides from one pit to another, lashing around the submerged leather so the 2 men could pull together, though the tanner often worked alone and had learned to manage the weight with patience and leverage rather than brute force. The palm fiber was golden brown and still held a faint trace of the tree's sweet smell, a tropical coconut-like scent that was entirely different from the mineral smells of the tannery, and that always surprised him slightly when he brought the rope close to his face. He checked the rope for fraying, running the length through his hands and feeling the slight bumps where the strands were spliced together, and he found no weak spots that needed repair. The rope was good, still strong, still supple, still ready for the work it was made to do. Beside the rope, a small collection of other items shared the corner, a lump of pumice stone for smoothing rough spots on wooden handles, a spare length of leather cord, a bent iron nail that he used for unpicking knots, and a folded square of old hide that he used as a kneeling mat when he had to work close to the ground for long periods. These small, unremarkable objects were the supporting cast in the daily drama of the tannery, and the tanner treated them with the same quiet respect he gave to the main implements, knowing that each had its role and that the absence of even the smallest item would disrupt the smooth flow of the work. The kneeling mat was worn almost through in the center, the leather blackened and compressed, and he made a mental note to replace it before the winter rains, a project that he would attend to in its own time, without hurry. The tanner took up the blunt scraper again and carried it to the edge of the nearest pit, where the cowhide that he had inspected earlier still floated just beneath the lime water. He knelt on the stone rim, placing the folded old hide under his knees to cushion them, and leaned forward until his face was only a short distance from the milky surface. The scraper felt familiar and balanced in his right hand, an extension of his arm, and he slid the curved blade into the water at a shallow angle, guiding it toward the nearest corner of the hide. The blade passed through the lime water with minimal disturbance, a smooth, silent entry that disturbed only the smallest of ripples, and when it made contact with the leather, he felt the familiar spongy resistance transmit itself up through the handle and into his palm. He worked the blade along the edge of the hide, not pressing hard but using a gentle, gliding pressure that followed the natural contour of the skin. And as he did so, small pieces of loosened hair drifted up from the surface like flakes of dark snow suspended in the white liquid. The scraping motion was circular and rhythmic, a slow, steady orbit that removed the debris from the hide without damaging the grain beneath. The tanner's wrist flexed in a pattern that had become automatic over the years, a tiny, precise movement that required no conscious direction, and his other hand rested on the stone rim for balance, the fingers slightly curled, the knuckles pale under the residue of lime. The sun had climbed past its midpoint now, and the light that fell on the yard was direct and bright, turning the lime water into a field of white fire that was almost painful to look at directly. So the tanner kept his gaze on the area just in front of the scraper where the water was shadowed by his own body. The scraping continued for a long stretch of minutes, the only sounds being the soft rustle of the blade against the hide and the slow drip of water from the scraper when he lifted it briefly to clear the accumulated hair. The work was monotonous in the best sense, a repeated action that freed the mind to wander or to rest, and the tanner let his thoughts drift where they would, not holding on to any single idea, just letting them pass like the clouds that were beginning to form over the eastern hills, thin white streaks that barely qualified as clouds at all. When he had scraped the entire surface of the cowhide that he could reach from his kneeling position, he rose slowly, his knees making the same faint popping sound they had made earlier, and he walked around to the other side of the pit to work on the remaining portion. This required the longer pole rather than the scraper for the initial lifting, and he retrieved the cedarwood pole from the shelter, laid the scraper aside on the stone divider, and repeated the careful lifting motion that he had performed during the inspection. The hide rose from the water, dripping and gleaming, and he supported its weight with the pole, while he used the scraper in his free hand to attend to the areas that had been submerged beyond his reach. This was awkward work that required a certain amount of contortion, leaning out over the pit with one arm extended while the other held the pole steady, and the strain was felt in his shoulders and lower back, a mild, warming effort that was not unpleasant. He worked methodically, moving the scraper in the same slow circles, watching the hair fall away in wet clumps that made a soft plopping sound when they hit the lime water, and when the entire hide was clean, he lowered it back into the pit with the same gentle, controlled motion, letting the water receive it without a splash. The hand scraper with the bone handle was next, and he took it to the third pit where the goat skins were stacked. Crouching at the edge, he lifted the topmost skin with the pole and laid it across the stone divider for better access, the thin leather draping over the stone like a wet cloth. The goat skin was much lighter than the cowhide, and he could handle it directly with his hands rather than relying on the pole, turning it over and smoothing it flat against the stone while he worked the hand scraper along the grain side. The smaller tool felt delicate in his grip, the bone handle warm against his palm, and his movements were correspondingly finer, shorter strokes that removed the last stubborn bits of hair from the areas around the legs and the tail where the lime water did not circulate as freely. The goat skin had a different texture under the blade, smoother and less fibrous than the cowhide, with a silky quality that would eventually translate into a soft, supple leather, suitable for the finest applications. The tanner appreciated this difference without articulating it in words, simply feeling the difference in his hands and adjusting his pressure accordingly. When the first goat skin was clean, he folded it carefully and set it on a clean stone to drain, then lifted the second skin from the stack and began again. The work continued in this fashion for a long time, the tanner moving from pit to pit with his tools, scraping and cleaning and returning the hides to their baths. The sun crossed the high point of its arc and began its slow descent toward the western hills, and the shadows that had been short and dense at midday began to stretch and thin, creeping outward from the shelter and the fig tree and the tanner's own feet. The heat of the afternoon was at its peak, a dry, enveloping warmth that wrapped around the yard and made the lime pits shimmer with a faint, watery mirage. and the tanner's thirst intensified to a point where it became a constant, dull pressure at the back of his throat, pushing against every swallow. He paused in his work to stand in the shade of the shelter, the scraper hanging loosely from his hand, and he looked at the clay jar of water that sat in the corner, its sides beaded with condensation where the evaporation cooled the contents. He did not go to it. He simply looked at it, acknowledging the water's existence, and the looking was almost a kind of drinking, a small satisfaction that helped him endure the remaining hours of the fast. The tools were now scattered around the yard rather than stored neatly in their corner, the poles leaning against different pits where he had last used them, the scrapers resting on stone dividers with their blades still wet, the clay pot of lime paste sitting beside the oxhide pit where he had applied a generous dab to the stubborn patches along the spine. This temporary disorder was a natural consequence of the work, and the tanner did not mind it. He knew where everything was, could reconstruct the path of his labor by following the trail of tools from one pit to the next. And when the day's tasks were complete, he would gather them all and return them to their places. For now, the scattered tools were like signs of a life being lived, evidence that the tannery was not an abandoned place, but a working concern, a site of slow, steady production that would eventually yield leather, the saddles and slippers, and the countless other objects that the city required. The tanner's hands, which had been clean when he rose from the shelter hours before, were now coated with a fresh layer of lime residue, the white patina extending up to his wrists where the lime water had dripped down from the lifted hides. The residue was beginning to dry and tighten, pulling at the skin with a faint, scratchy sensation that was not painful, but noticeable. And he rubbed his palms together briskly to shake off the loose powder, a cloud of white dust puffing into the air and settling on his tunic. The olive oil would come later, at the end of the day when the work was finished and the sun was low, and the anticipation of that small comfort was something he held in the back of his mind, a quiet reward waiting at the end of the long afternoon. For now, his hands were working hands, tools in their own right, and they would continue to serve him until the last hide was scraped and the last pole was wiped, and the last drip of lime water had fallen from the stone dividers onto the packed earth of the yard. The sun reached its highest point and seemed to pause there, as if it needed a moment of rest before beginning the slow descent toward evening. The light that fell on the tannery was no longer the slanted golden light of morning, but a direct, vertical radiance that poured straight down from the bright dome of the sky and filled every corner of the yard with a hard white brilliance. The shadows had contracted to their smallest possible dimensions, dark pools tucked tightly against the bases of objects, offering no real relief from the glare. The lime pits, which had glowed softly in the early hours, now blazed with a fierce, reflective intensity that made the eyes ache if one looked too long, and the tanner kept his gaze lowered or directed toward the shaded areas as he moved through the yard. The heat was a physical presence, a heavy blanket that pressed down on the shoulders and made the air shimmer above the stone dividers in slow, wavy distortions. The tanner had finished the scraping work some time ago, and the tools now rested where they lay, scattered at intervals along the walkways between the pits. The blunt scraper lay across a stone divider near the first pit, its iron blade warming in the sun, and its wooden handle casting a short, fat shadow. The bone-handled hand scraper sat beside the goatskin pit, and the poles leaned at various angles against the shelter wall where he had returned them after the final lift. The clay pot of lime paste had been resealed and placed back in its corner, the linen cloth tied tightly against the heat that would otherwise dry the mixture into an unusable crust. Everything was in order, or as much order as the work required, and the tanner felt the satisfaction of tasks completed settling into his mind like sediment settling to the bottom of a still pond, a quiet, clear feeling that required no celebration. He walked slowly to the shelter, his steps shorter now in the midday heat, his slippers making a soft, dragging sound on the packed earth because he no longer lifted his feet as high as he had in the cool of the morning. The shade under the reed awning was a gift, a pocket of relative coolness that felt by contrast with the open yard, almost like stepping into a different season. The reeds above his head had dried and cured over years of sun exposure, until they were the color of honey, and they filtered the harsh midday light into a softer, amber-toned glow that was easier on the eyes and gentler on the spirit. A low stone bench sat against the back wall of the shelter, a simple slab of grey rock that had been placed there by the tanner's predecessor, and had been worn smooth by generations of men sitting on it during the hottest hours of the day. The bench was cool to the touch, the stone having retained some of the night's chill despite the advancing heat, and the tanner settled onto it with a long, slow exhalation that seemed to release a tension he had not known he was carrying. From the bench, his view of the tannery was framed by the drooping edge of the reed awning and the trunk of the fig tree, a natural window that showed him a portion of the nearest lime pit and the stone wall beyond. The lime pit in his view was the one containing the cowhide he had scraped earlier, and the surface of the water was now perfectly still, a flat white plain that reflected the pale sky and the thin belly of a single cloud that had drifted into the frame. The cloud was small and white and unremarkable, a wisp of condensed moisture that moved so slowly across the blue that its motion was almost imperceptible, like the minute hand of a water clock. The tanner watched it without really watching, his eyes resting on the general scene rather than any specific detail, his mind entering a state of diffuse awareness that was neither wakefulness nor sleep, but something between, a kind of waking rest that the body takes when there is nothing to do and nowhere to go. The heat had silenced many of the sounds that had filled the morning. The sparrows had retreated from the fig tree to some cooler hiding place, and the crows were long gone, leaving the sky empty of birds. The lizard was hidden deep in its crack in the wall, its tiny body pressed against the cool interior stone. Even the bees had reduced their activity, their drone fading to a sporadic, sleepy murmur that came and went without pattern. The only constant sound was the faint, high-pitched whine of the heat itself, a sound that was not really a sound at all, but a kind of auditory illusion created by the shimmering air and the absolute stillness of the afternoon. It was the sound of summer, the sound of the sun at its zenith, and it had been a companion to the tanner's midday rests for as many years as he had worked in this yard. His body, now that it was still, began to send him the full report of its condition, an inventory of sensations that he received without judgment. The soles of his feet were warm and slightly swollen from standing and walking on the hot stone, and he eased his slippers off with his toes, letting his bare feet rest on the cooler packed earth under the bench. The small of his back held a dull ache from the bending and lifting of the morning's work, a familiar ache that would fade by evening and return tomorrow and fade again, a cycle as regular as the phases of the moon. His shoulders were tight, and he rolled them backward in slow circles, feeling the muscles stretch and release, the movement causing a soft popping sound somewhere near his shoulder blades. His forearms felt heavy, the muscles tired from gripping the scrapers and the poles, and he rested them on his thighs with the palms turned upward, the same posture of open rest he had adopted earlier in the day. The thirst was now the dominant sensation, a constant, dry presence that had moved beyond mere discomfort into a kind of sustained note that played in the background of every other feeling. His tongue felt thick and slightly rough, and when he swallowed, there was a moment of stickiness before the throat completed its motion. The inside of his mouth tasted faintly of the lime dust that had been suspended in the air during the scraping, a chalky, mineral taste that no amount of saliva could wash away. His lips were dry and beginning to tighten, and he moistened them with his tongue in a reflex that brought only momentary relief before the dryness returned. The clay jar of water sat in the corner of the shelter, perhaps 10 paces away, and the thought of it was a cool blue thread in the red fabric of the afternoon. He did not go to it, for the fast held him and the discipline of Ramadan was the structure he had chosen to inhabit, a voluntary architecture of restraint that shaped the hours and gave them meaning. The thirst, like the heat and the ache in his back, was simply a condition to be observed and accepted, not a problem to be solved. The fast connected him in a way that was both abstract and deeply personal to the whole city behind the tannery wall. Every man and woman and older child in Fez was experiencing the same dry throat at this moment, the same hollow stomach, the same slow, heavy passage of the midday hours. The water sellers who carried their goatskin bags through the streets were fasting even as they poured water for others, a discipline that the tanner admired in a quiet, unspoken way. The scholars at the great mosque were fasting, their throats dry as they recited verses from memory, their minds focused on the holy words rather than the physical discomfort. The merchants in the souk were fasting, sitting in the shade of their awnings and fanning themselves with palm leaves, their shops open, but their bodies abstaining. The bakers who stoked the fires of the communal ovens were fasting even as the smell of bread surrounded them, a test of will that seemed to the tanner more difficult than his own quiet thirst. And somewhere in the narrow streets, the children who were old enough to fast for the first time were learning the same lesson he had learned as a boy, that the body could be mastered by the will, and that the mastery brought a strange, quiet pride that was not pride in the ordinary sense, but a kind of peaceful self-respect. The tanner's thoughts drifted, as they always did when he sat on the bench in the shelter, to the nature of the work that surrounded him. The hides soaking in the lime pits were in a state of transformation that was invisible to the eye, but as real as the stone under his feet. The lime was loosening the hair and swelling the fibers, preparing the skins for the next stage of their journey toward becoming leather, and this process could not be rushed. It took exactly as long as it took, and the hides that had been in the pits for 5 days would need 5 more, or perhaps 7, depending on the thickness of the skin and the strength of the lime and the temperature of the water. The tanner could not hurry this process any more than he could hurry the sun across the sky, and he had learned over the course of his working life to align his own pace with the pace of the chemistry, to move at the speed that the leather demanded. This alignment had become, over time, not just a work practice but a philosophy, a way of being in the world that extended beyond the tannery walls. He was a patient man because the hides had taught him patience, and the patience had seeped into his character the way the lime had seeped into his hands, a permanent alteration that could not be undone. The light on the water of the nearest pit shifted slightly as the sun moved an almost imperceptible distance to the west, and the reflection of the cloud that had been visible earlier was now a different shape, stretched and distorted by the angle of the rays. The tanner noticed this without comment, storing the information away as a marker of time's passage. The afternoon was advancing, and eventually he would need to rise and perform the midday prayer, then perhaps turn the hides that needed turning, but there was no urgency in the thought. The prayer had its appointed time, and he would meet it, and the hides would wait as they always waited, and the sun would continue its slow arc regardless of what he did or did not do. This was the comfort of a life governed by natural rhythms rather than by clocks and schedules. There was always enough time because time was not a commodity to be spent, but a medium to be inhabited, like the air or the light. A single bee wandered into the shelter, its flight path lazy and meandering, its body heavy with pollen from the wild thyme on the hillside. It circled the tanner's head once, its buzz a low, furry sound that was close enough to feel as a vibration in the air. Then it drifted away toward the fig tree, perhaps mistaking the shadow for a source of nectar. The tanner's eyes followed it without moving his head, tracking its slow progress across the yard until it disappeared into the leaves, and then his gaze returned to the lime pit and the pale, still water and the faint outline of the hide beneath. The bee's visit had lasted only a few seconds, but it had broken the stillness in a way that made the stillness, when it returned, seem deeper and more complete, as if the small disturbance had reset the quiet and allowed it to settle more heavily than before. His thoughts turned, without any particular direction, to the leather that the hides would eventually become. The cowhide in the first pit, once it had been limed and scraped and tanned and dried and finished, would be cut into pieces that would serve many different purposes. The thickest part of the hide, from the shoulder and the back, would become the sole of a sandal or the strap of a harness, while the thinner sections from the belly would be used for bookbindings or the covering of small boxes. The ram's hide would make a soft, pliable leather suitable for the inner lining of slippers, and the goatskins would be transformed into the fine, almost translucent material that the best bookbinders preferred, a leather that took gold tooling beautifully and smelled, when finished, of tannins and smoke. The ox hide in the fourth pit would probably become a large piece of equipment, perhaps the bellows for a blacksmith's forge or the covering for a water wheel, something that required strength and durability above all else. Each hide had a destination, a purpose that was already loosely determined by its size and quality and the needs of the market. But the tanner did not think of these destinations in terms of commerce or profit. He thought of them in terms of continuity, the way the leather would outlast him and perhaps outlast his children, the way a well-made bookbinding might protect a manuscript for centuries, the way a pair of slippers might walk the streets of Fez long after the hands that made them had returned to the earth. The heat pressed down on the reed awning, and the smell of the dry reeds intensified, a warm biscuity scent that mingled with the lime and the distant, faint odor of the city. The tanner's eyelids grew heavy, not with the heaviness of true sleep, but with a kind of surface drowsiness that made the world seem slightly distant and softened, as if viewed through a thin layer of gauze. He allowed his eyes to close, just for a moment, and the red darkness behind his eyelids was a relief from the bright glare of the yard. In this darkness the sounds of the afternoon became more distinct. The distant rhythmic clang of the blacksmith's hammer, the fainter ring of the coppersmith, the occasional bray of a donkey from the direction of the river gate, the high, thin cry of a hawk circling somewhere above the hills. These sounds arranged themselves into a kind of music, a slow, irregular percussion that had no melody but possessed a rhythm that was soothing in its predictability, a pattern of noises that had been playing over the city for as long as the city had existed. The tanner opened his eyes after a time and looked up at the underside of the reed awning, where the individual stalks were visible in cross-section, their hollow interiors forming tiny dark circles that repeated in endless variation across the surface. A spider had spun a web in one corner of the awning, a delicate dusty construction that caught the light and revealed its geometry in fine, silvery lines. The spider herself was a small brown creature that sat at the center of the web with the patience of a creature that understood waiting as a way of life, her legs barely moving, her whole being focused on the tremor that would signal the arrival of prey. The tanner watched the spider for a while, thinking nothing, just observing the stillness of the small brown body and the intricate pattern of the web. And then he lowered his gaze back to the yard where the lime pits waited in the hot, white light. The sun had moved enough now that the shadow of the shelter was beginning to lengthen, creeping slowly outward across the packed earth toward the nearest pit. The tanner measured the distance with his eyes and calculated without numbers that perhaps 2 hours had passed since he had sat down, perhaps a little more. The day was crossing its midpoint, tilting toward evening, and the quality of the light was beginning to change in ways that were too subtle for words, but unmistakable to someone who had spent a lifetime watching the sky. The heat was still intense, but there was a hint of softening at its edges, a barely perceptible relaxation that would become more pronounced as the afternoon wore on. The tanner felt this change in his body, a slight lifting of the oppression that the midday sun had brought, and he straightened his spine against the bench, preparing himself for the next round of small tasks that would fill the hours until sunset. He stood up slowly, his bare feet pressing into the cool earth under the bench, and he reached down to retrieve his slippers, sliding them back onto his feet with a practiced motion. The leather was warm from the sun and soft against his soles. He walked to the edge of the shelter and stood there for a moment, looking out at the rows of lime pits, the white surfaces glowing under the afternoon sun, the dark shapes of the hides suspended beneath. The yard was exactly as he had left it, the tools resting where they lay, the water still and patient, the chemistry of lime and leather continuing its invisible work. Nothing had changed, and everything had changed, for the day had moved forward and the hides had soaked for several more hours, and the tanner himself had rested and was now ready to continue. He stepped out of the shade and into the light, feeling the immediate warmth on his head and shoulders, and he walked toward the first pit to begin the afternoon's work, his thirst still a steady note within him, his mind still calm, the fast still holding, the day unfolding at the slow, measured pace that the leather demanded. The tanner crossed the yard with the slow, deliberate stride of a man who had already done a full day's work and was now beginning the second half of a rhythm that would not end until dusk, his shadow stretching behind him as a thin, elongated shape that rippled over the uneven stones and the crusted rims of the pits. The heat of the afternoon had not lessened in any measurable way, but it had shifted its character from the direct, hammering intensity of noon to a broader, more diffuse warmth that seemed to come from all directions at once, radiating upward from the stones and downward from the pale sky and sideways from the walls that had been baking in the sun since early morning. The lime pits caught this light and held it, their surfaces becoming flat white mirrors that threw the glare back into the air, and the tanner squinted slightly as he approached the first basin, his eyes adjusting to the brightness with the practiced ease of a man who had spent a lifetime in this luminous, mineral world. He retrieved the cedarwood pole from where it leaned against the shelter wall, its shaft still carrying a faint dampness from the morning's work, and he carried it horizontally as he walked along the stone divider that separated the first pit from the second. The pole felt different in his hands now than it had at dawn, its weight more familiar after the hours of use, its surface warmed by the sun so that it no longer felt cool against his palms, but instead radiated a gentle, woody heat that was pleasant to the touch. The tanner positioned himself at the midpoint of the first pit, where the cowhide had been floating for several days with its loosened hair and its swollen grain, and he planted his feet on the stable stones that he knew would not shift, the same stones he had stood on during the inspection, the same stance he had taken 1,000 times before. The muscle memory of the position was so deeply ingrained that his body found it without conscious direction, his feet settling into the familiar depressions where the stone had worn down under his weight over the years. The process of turning a hide in the lime pit was a simple operation that required no great strength or skill, only patience and a certain feel for the way the wet leather moved through the water. The tanner inserted the tip of the pole into the milky liquid at a shallow angle, sliding it beneath the nearest edge of the cowhide with the same gentle, probing motion he had used during the inspection, and he felt the familiar spongy resistance as the wood made contact with the submerged skin. The hide had been floating with its grain side facing upward toward the air and its flesh side facing downward toward the bottom of the pit, and the purpose of the turning was to reverse this orientation, to expose the other side of the leather to the lime solution so that the chemical action would proceed evenly through the entire thickness of the skin. Without turning, the upward side would receive more of the lime's effect, while the downward side would lag behind, and the resulting leather would be uneven, patchy, a flawed product that no craftsman would want to buy. So the turning was done every hour, or as close to every hour as the tanner's sense of time allowed, a regular rotation that ensured the uniformity of the liming process. He wet the pole deeper under the hide, feeling the weight of the waterlogged skin transmit itself up the shaft as a slow, heavy pressure, and then he began to lift and twist in a single, continuous motion that used the rim of the stone basin as a pivot point. The hide rose from the water with a soft, sucking sound, the lime solution streaming off its surface in thick white rivulets that splashed back into the pit with a sound like a small waterfall heard from a distance. The grain side, which had been facing upward, was pale and swollen and mostly bare of hair, its surface dotted with the tiny craters where the follicles had released their hold, and as the hide came free of the water, the air struck it and immediately began to dry the outermost layer of moisture, giving the skin a momentary dullness before the remaining liquid sheeted off and left it glistening again. The tanner balanced the heavy skin on the pole, using his body weight to counterbalance the load, and he rotated the pole slowly between his hands, a quarter turn that brought the leading edge of the hide up and over in a rolling motion that reminded him, if he thought about it at all, of the way a baker turns a large round of dough on a board. The hide flopped over with a wet, heavy sound, the flesh side now exposed to the air, a surface that was smoother and paler than the grain side and marked with the faint impressions of the veins and arteries that had once run beneath the skin. This flesh side had been submerged for days without direct contact with the air, and it was saturated with lime water to a deeper degree. Its texture softer and more gelatinous than the grain side, and as it settled onto the surface of the pit with the grain side now facing down into the liquid, a fresh wave of cloudiness spread outward through the water, a bloom of suspended lime particles that had been trapped against the hide and were now released into the solution. The tanner withdrew the pole slowly, letting the hide settle into its new position, and he stood for a moment watching the cloud of white particles drift and swirl in the water, a slow, lazy turbulence that gradually began to calm as the heavier particles sank and the finer ones remained suspended, creating a faint haze that would persist until the next turning or until the natural stillness of the pit reasserted itself. The water, which had been relatively clear before the turning, was now distinctly cloudier, the milky opacity intensified so that the outline of the hide beneath the surface was softened and blurred, a dark shape seen through a fog. The tanner observed this without concern, for the cloudiness was a sign that the lime was active and that the hide was releasing its remaining impurities into the solution, a necessary part of the process that would eventually slow as the leather reached the proper state of liming. He moved along the stone divider to the second pit, where the ram's hide waited with its mass of grey wool still largely intact, and he repeated the turning motion with a slightly different technique, adapted to the lighter weight and woollier texture of the skin. The ram's hide was smaller and easier to maneuver, and the pole required less leverage to lift it, the tip sliding under the edge near what had been the animal's flank, and raising the wet skin with a smooth, easy motion that barely disturbed the surface of the water. The wool, waterlogged and heavy, hung down in long dripping ropes that swung gently as the hide rose. And when the tanner rotated the pole to flick the skin over, the wool followed the motion like a curtain of grey water, slapping softly against the stone rim and then settling onto the new surface with a sigh. The wool on the underside of the hide, which had been pressed against the flesh side in the water, was more compacted and held less air, and when it was exposed to the atmosphere, it began to release tiny bubbles of trapped gas with a faint, effervescent fizzing sound that was barely audible over the general quiet of the yard. The ram's hide settled into its new position, flesh side now facing up, wool side now facing down into the lime, and the water in this pit also clouded, a gradual bloom of whiteness that spread from the disturbed area outward in slow, concentric rings until the entire basin had a uniform, pearly opacity. The tanner continued to the third pit, the shallow basin where the goat skins were stacked in their neat pile, and here the turning was a more delicate operation because the skins were thin and easily torn and because they were stacked rather than floating freely. He used the shorter pole with the flattened tip, inserting it carefully between the second and third skins in the stack, and he lifted the top two skins together, peeling them back as if turning the pages of a large, wet book. The goat skins were so thin that the light shone through them when they were lifted, revealing the network of blood vessels as dark, branching lines against the translucent background, and the tanner handled them with particular gentleness, supporting their weight along the length of the pole so that no single point of pressure could create a tear. He laid the lifted skins on the stone divider beside the pit, their surfaces glistening and dripping, and then he turned his attention to the remaining skins in the basin, using his hands rather than the pole to flip each one individually, the leather cool and slippery against his palms, and the smell of the goat skins, which was milder and cleaner than the other hides, rising to his nostrils as he worked. When the skins in the pit had all been turned, he lifted the two skins from the stone divider and placed them back on top of the stack, reversing their order so that the one that had been on top was now on the bottom of the top layer. A small adjustment that ensured every skin received equal time in every position over the course of the days. The goat pit clouded only slightly, for the skins were small and the disturbance was minimal, but a faint haze of lime particles spread through the water nonetheless, a soft veil that would settle by the time the tanner returned for the next turning. The fourth pit, the one containing the immense ox hide, required the thick oak pole because the cedar wood pole would have bent too much under the weight. The tanner retrieved the oak pole from the shelter, its greater heft, a solid, reassuring presence in his hands, and he braced his feet more widely on the stone divider to give himself a stable base for the lift. The ox hide was heavy, easily twice the weight of the cowhide, and it had been soaking for fewer days, so its fibers were still relatively stiff, resisting the lime softening effect with the stubbornness that came from the thick neck and shoulder skin of a large draft animal. The tanner inserted the blunt end of the oak pole under the edge of the hide and leaned his body weight into the motion, not with a sudden heave, but with a slow increasing pressure that gradually overcame the inertia of the submerged leather. The hide began to lift, the water pouring off it in a thick sheet that made a sound like rain hitting a roof, and the tanner felt the strain along his arms and across his shoulders and into his lower back, a strain that was not painful but demanding, requiring his full attention and his full strength. The ox hide emerged from the pit like a dark island rising from a white sea, its dimensions revealed as the water fell away, a huge irregular oval that spanned nearly the full width of the basin, its surface marked with the stubborn patches of dark hair that the lime had not yet conquered, and with the paler areas where the hair had loosened and fallen away. The tanner rotated the hide with a series of small, controlled movements, using the rim of the pit as a fulcrum and letting the weight of the skin work with him rather than against him. And when the flip was complete and the flesh side, which had been facing down, now faced up toward the sky, he lowered the hide back into the water with the same slow, controlled motion, letting it settle without a splash. The water in the ox pit erupted into a thick cloud of white that was so dense it obscured the hide entirely from view, and the tanner knew that it would take the better part of the hour for the particles to settle and the water to clear, which was perfectly acceptable and indeed expected, for the large hides always caused more disturbance than the small ones. The turning continued down the first row and up the second, a circuit that carried the tanner past every basin in the yard and involved the lifting and flipping of every hide currently soaking in the lime pits. Some of the hides were light and cooperative, turning easily with minimal effort, while others were heavy or awkwardly shaped and required a longer struggle with the pole and a more careful positioning of the body. The sheepskins, of which there were many, floated like pale woolly clouds and turned with a gentle rolling motion that was almost pleasant to perform, while the camel hides, which were few but large, were dense and tough and absorbed the lime water into their thick fibers so thoroughly that they seemed to weigh twice as much when lifted as they had when dry. The tanner worked through the entire collection methodically, not rushing and not lingering, his pace steady and sustainable, his mind occupied only with the immediate sensations of the work, the weight of the pole, the resistance of the hide, the sound of the water, the smell of the lime. By the time he had completed one full circuit of the yard, the sun had moved a noticeable distance to the west, and the shadows had lengthened from the stunted pools of noon into more generous shapes that offered real shade to the areas near the wall and the shelter. The tanner returned the poles to their resting place, wiping each one down with the dry rag to remove the excess water and prevent the wood from becoming waterlogged and heavy, and then he walked back to the shelter and sat down on the stone bench, his breathing slightly elevated from the exertion, but his mind calm and empty, a still pool of water in the center of his head. The turning had taken perhaps half an hour, or perhaps a little more, and he knew that in another hour he would need to repeat the entire process, for the hides required regular turning to ensure even liming, and the rhythm of the afternoon was built around these hourly repetitions. This was not a burden or a chore. It was simply the structure of the day, a framework of small, necessary actions that gave shape to the hours and kept the tanner's body in motion and his mind at rest. He sat on the bench and looked out at the pits, where the water in each basin was slowly settling after the disturbance of the turning. The cloudiness that had bloomed during the process was already beginning to fade in the nearest pits, the heavier lime particles sinking toward the bottom while the finer particles remained suspended, creating a faint, milky haze that was less dense than before. The surfaces of the pits were returning to their glassy stillness, the ripples from the turning having reached the stone edges and dissipated, and the reflected sky was once again visible as a pale, motionless field above the submerged hides. The tanner watched the settling with a kind of detached fascination, the same quiet interest with which he might watch the movement of clouds or the slow crawl of a shadow across a wall, and he felt his own mind settling in parallel with the water, the small disturbances of the work fading away and leaving behind a clear, quiet calm that was as still as the surface of the oldest pit. The hour between turnings passed in a manner that did not feel like the passage of time at all, but rather like a gentle, undifferentiated expanse of quiet in which nothing happened and nothing needed to happen. The tanner remained on the bench, rising only once to adjust the position of the reed mat that had shifted in the breeze, and to drink a small sip of the cool air that came from the direction of the river, a sip that did nothing for his thirst but felt pleasant on his dry lips. The lizard emerged again from its crack and basked in the late afternoon sun, its tiny rib cage expanding and contracting with rapid shallow breaths, and the sparrows returned to the fig tree, chirping softly as they settled into the branches for the approach of evening. The distant sounds of the city continued their muted murmur, and the tanner let them wash over him without listening, his attention turned inward to the quiet space that the turning had created. When the hour had passed, he rose from the bench and retrieved the pole again, and the entire circuit was repeated exactly as before. The cowhide turned, the ram's hide turned, the ram's hide turned. The goat skins lifted and restacked and turned. The ox hide heaved and flipped. The sheepskins and camel hides and all the other skins in their various states of liming rotated through the same slow, careful motion that brought the underside to the surface and the underside to the underside. The water clouded again. The particles stirred into suspension by the disturbance, and then the settling began again. The slow descent of lime particles through the milky liquid, a process that would be complete just in time for the next turning. The tanner worked with the same steady, unhurried pace, his body moving through the familiar sequence as if it were a dance that required no thought, only presence, and his mind remained empty and peaceful, a quiet observer of the simple, repetitive actions that filled the afternoon. The cycle repeated itself a third time, and the sun had moved considerably now, its lower edge approaching the tops of the hills to the west, and its light taking on the golden, honeyed quality that signaled the approach of evening. The shadows of the stone dividers stretched across the yard like dark ribbons, and the lime pits reflected the warm light with a softer, less intense glow than they had at midday. The tanner completed the third turning with the same care he had given the first, his arms now tired in a deep, satisfying way, his hands coated with a fresh layer of lime residue, his tunic damp with the splashings of the water, and his own sweat, which had dried and left faint white salt lines along the wool fibers. He returned the pole to the shelter for the final time that afternoon, for the day's turning was now complete, and he stood at the edge of the yard looking at the rows of pits where the hides rested in their newly turned positions, the water slowly clearing, the chemistry continuing its invisible work, the cycle of turning and settling and turning again, as natural and as necessary as the beating of his own heart. The thought of the sunset, which would bring the call to prayer and the first sip of water and the sweet taste of a date after the long fast, was now present in his mind as a quiet, warm anticipation. But it did not disturb the peace that the turning had cultivated, a peace that settled over him like the settling lime particles, soft and white and complete. The third turning was complete, and the tanner returned to the stone bench under the reed shelter with the slow, heavy steps of a man whose body had given its strength to the work, and now asked only for stillness in return. His arms hung at his sides with a pleasant, drained weariness, the muscles of his shoulders and forearms loose and warm, and his hands, still wet with lime water, rested palm upward on his thighs in the posture that had become the signature of his afternoon rests. The bench received him as it had received him 1,000 times before, its smooth stone cool against his back even now when the heat of the day still lingered in the air, and he let his head tilt back until it touched the rough wall of the shelter, his gaze lifting to the underside of the reed awning where the spider still waited at the center of her web, patient and motionless, a tiny brown jewel suspended in a geometry of silk. The afternoon had entered its long, slow lull, that stretch of time between the last of the heavy work and the first hint of evening when the day seemed to hold its breath, and the world grew quiet in a way that was different from the quiet of dawn. The morning quiet was a quiet of anticipation, of the day yet to unfold, while the afternoon quiet was a quiet of fulfillment, of work accomplished and time still remaining, a gentle, open space that asked nothing and expected nothing. The tanner inhabited this space fully, his mind not empty, but filled with a soft, diffuse awareness that drifted from one small thing to another without urgency or pattern, like a butterfly moving from flower to flower in a garden that had no boundaries. His eyes moved slowly across the yard, tracing the familiar shapes of the lime pits and the stone dividers and a lone fig tree near the wall. But his gaze did not fix on any single object for long. Instead, it wandered and settled and moved on again, noticing the small details that the busier hours of the day had obscured. The patterns in the lime crust along the edges of the pits were intricate and varied, a kind of natural calligraphy written by evaporation and chemical reaction, and the tanner observed these patterns with a quiet, wordless appreciation. On the rim of the nearest pit, the crust had formed the delicate filigree of tiny ridges and valleys that resembled the veins of a leaf or the tributaries of a river seen from a great height, a white landscape in miniature that would crumble at the slightest touch, but that held in its fragile existence a record of every drip and splash and drying cycle that had occurred over the past days. On another rim, the crust was thicker and more substantial, built up in layers like the strata of sedimentary rock, each layer representing a different week or month of accumulation, and the edges of these layers were sharp and clean where they had cracked in the heat, exposing the history of the pit in cross-section. A stray cat had found a warm spot on the stone wall near the fig tree, a patch of sun that had not yet been overtaken by the lengthening shadows, and it lay stretched out along the top of the wall, with its eyes closed and its tail hanging down in a lazy curve that twitched occasionally in response to some dream or some distant sound. The cat was a thin grey creature with ears that showed the nicks and tears of a life spent in the streets and alleys of the old city, and it had been visiting the tannery for years, appearing at odd hours to hunt the mice that nested in the piles of scrap leather, or simply to bask in the warmth of the stones. The tanner had no particular relationship with the cat, no name for it and no expectation of affection, but he noted its presence with a small, quiet pleasure, the way one notes the arrival of a familiar bird at a windowsill. The cat's sides rose and fell with the slow rhythm of sleep, its breathing so steady and deep that the tanner could see the movement from across the yard, and this rhythm seemed to synchronize with his own breathing after a while, the two of them inhaling and exhaling in a slow shared tempo that crossed the distance between the bench and the wall like a quiet conversation spoken in no language at all. From somewhere deep within the city, a sound drifted over the rooftops and the walls and the open ground of the tannery, a sound that was thin and high and melodic, carried on the same breeze that rustled the reed mats and stirred the surface of the lime pits. It was the sound of children reciting, the voices of young boys in a school attached to one of the smaller mosques, their words indistinct but their rhythm clear, a chanting, sing-song cadence that rose and fell in patterns that had been memorized and repeated for centuries. The tanner could not make out the words, for the distance was too great and the breeze was too fickle, but he recognized the rhythm as the rhythm of Quranic recitation, the same verses that he himself had learned as a boy in a room much like the one where these children now sat, rocking back and forth on their heels as they committed the holy text to memory. The sound was soothing in its regularity, a human music that had nothing to do with entertainment and everything to do with devotion, and it blended with the other sounds of the afternoon, the rustle of the fig leaves and the distant clang of the smiths and the low, steady drone of the bees, to create a tapestry of noise that was so familiar and so constant that the tanner was not consciously aware of hearing it at all. His thoughts, which had been diffuse and wandering, now began to coalesce around a series of images that drifted through his mind like the clouds that were gathering in the western sky, thin white streaks that promised no rain but added a certain softness to the late afternoon light. He thought of the market that would take place later in the week, the great Thursday souk where the leather merchants displayed their wares on long wooden tables under awnings of striped cloth, and where the tanners of Fez brought their finished hides to be examined and priced and sold to the craftsmen, who would turn them into saddles and slippers and book-bindings, and the countless other objects that the city required. The market was a place of noise and colour and lively commerce, so different from the quiet yard where the hides spent their long, slow days in the lime pits, and the tanner visited it only when he had leather to sell, which was perhaps once a month or once every 2 months, depending on the pace of the tanning. He did not dislike the market, but he did not love it either. It was simply a necessary part of the cycle, the point at which the quiet work of the tannery connected with the wider world of trade and exchange. And he fulfilled his role in that connection with the same steady, unassuming competence that he brought to every other task. The leather that he would take to the next market was still in the pits, still in the early stages of its transformation. But he could already see in his mind the finished products that it would become. The cowhide that he had turned an hour ago would make a fine, sturdy leather for saddle seats, the kind of leather that would polish to a deep, rich brown with use and that would last for decades if properly cared for. The goat skins, thin and supple, would be perfect for the inner linings of slippers, the part that touched the foot and needed to be soft and smooth and free of any roughness. The ram's hide, with its dense wool that was now loosening in the lime, would produce a leather of medium weight and good flexibility, suitable for the covers of books or the binding of small chests. And the ox hide, the great heavy skin that was still resisting the lime in stubborn patches along its spine, would eventually become something large and utilitarian, perhaps a water bucket for a well, or the bellows of a forge, or the covering of a merchant's pack saddle. Each hide had its destiny, and the tanner played his part in that destiny without any sense of ownership or pride, simply as a link in a chain that stretched from the herders who raised the animals to the craftsmen who shaped the finished leather into objects of use and beauty. These thoughts drifted across his mind like the clouds drifted across the sky, not lingering, not demanding attention, simply passing through and then fading away. The tanner did not hold on to them or follow them to their conclusions. He let them come and let them go. his mind returning after each brief excursion to the immediate physical reality of the bench and the shelter and the lime pits and the grey cat sleeping on the wall. The afternoon lull was a time for such drifting, a time when the boundaries between thinking and dreaming became soft and permeable, and the tanner had long ago learned to trust this state, to allow his mind to wander where it would, without trying to control or direct the flow. The wandering was its own kind of rest, a mental equivalent of the physical rest his body was taking on the stone bench, and it left him feeling refreshed in a way that was difficult to describe, but easy to recognize. A lightness of spirit that came from having let go of the need to focus or to achieve or to plan. A small movement near the fig tree caught his eye, and he turned his head slightly to see that the grey cat had woken from its nap and was now sitting up on the wall, its front paws tucked neatly under its chest, and its eyes half closed against the brightness of the afternoon. The cat yawned, a wide, slow yawn that revealed a pink mouth and a row of tiny, sharp teeth. And then it began to wash its face with a methodical, unhurried attention, licking its paw and drawing it over its ear and its whiskers and the top of its head in a sequence of motions that was as rhythmic and as practiced as the tanner's own turning of the hides. The cat's ablutions continued for a long while, and the tanner watched with the same detached, peaceful interest with which he had watched the settling of the lime particles in the water, observing the way the cat's tongue, small and pink and precisely shaped, moved over the grey fur in even strokes that left a faint trail of dampness that quickly dried in the warm air. When the cat was satisfied with its grooming, it rose, stretched each leg in turn with a luxurious, trembling extension, and then jumped down from the wall into the scrubland beyond the tannery, disappearing among the thorny shrubs with a flick of its tail that was the last thing the tanner saw of it. The absence of the cat left the wall empty, and the tanner's gaze moved from that empty space to the hills beyond, where the light was beginning to take on the first faint golden tones of late afternoon. The hills had been brown and hazy through the heat of midday, but now they were sharpening as the air cooled slightly and the dust began to settle, and the tanner could see the individual shapes of the olive trees that dotted the lower slopes and the darker patches of shadow where the ravines cut into the hillsides. The sky above the hills was still a clean, pale blue, but there was a softness at its edges now, a gradual transition from blue to a warmer, yellower tone near the horizon that spoke of the evening's approach. The sun, though still well above the hills, had lost the fierce white intensity of noon and was now a gentler, rounder disk that could be glanced at without pain, its light spreading across the yard in long golden rays that made the lime pits glow with a warm, honeyed luminescence. The tanner's thoughts drifted again, this time to the meal that would break the fast when the sun finally dipped below the horizon and the muezzin's voice called out from the minaret of the great mosque. The meal would be simple, as all his meals were simple. A few dates to begin, as the Prophet had prescribed, then water, cool and fresh from the clay jar, then a bowl of harira, the thick, fragrant soup of tomatoes and lentils and chickpeas that the women of the neighborhood prepared in large pots and shared among the families. There would be bread, round loaves of semolina flour baked in the communal oven, and perhaps some olives, the small black olives that were cured in salt and oil and had a sharp, rich taste that lingered on the tongue. And there would be sweet mint tea afterward, poured from a height into small clear glasses, the foam rising to the top and the steam carrying the scent of the fresh leaves into the cooling evening air. The thought of this meal was not a torment to the tanner, not a source of desperate longing or impatient hunger, but a quiet, comforting anticipation that sat in the back of his mind like a promise waiting to be kept, a gentle warmth that made the remaining hours of the fast easier to bear rather than harder. His body, which had been still for a long while now, began to send him small signals of its needs, the same signals it sent every afternoon during the lull. His back, which had ached mildly from the bending and lifting, was now loose and comfortable, the muscles having relaxed during the long sit on the bench. His hands, which had been coated with lime residue, were now dry and the residue had flaked away in places, leaving pale, powdery patches on his tunic where he had wiped them. His thirst, which had been a sharp, demanding presence at midday, had settled into a dull background note that he could ignore for long stretches, though it returned each time he swallowed or thought of the clay jar in the corner of the shelter. And his stomach, empty since the pre-dawn meal, was a hollow, quiet space that produced occasional soft rumbles that were audible only to himself, and that he found almost companionable, a reminder that the fast was still in progress and that the discipline was still holding. The recitation from the distant school had stopped some time ago. The children released from their lessons to return to their homes and await the evening meal, and in its place came other sounds from the city. The creak of cartwheels and the call of a vendor selling fresh herbs, and the high, laughing voices of children playing in one of the small squares. These sounds were the sounds of normal life resuming after the long, hot stillness of the afternoon, and they told the tanner that the city was beginning to stir, that the fast would soon be broken, that the day was moving toward its conclusion in the natural, unhurried way that all days move toward their conclusions. He felt a quiet kinship with the people behind those sounds, the men and women and children who had also fasted through the long hours and who were now preparing, in their various ways, for the evening that would bring relief and nourishment and the comfort of shared meals and shared prayers. The tannery, isolated as it was on the outskirts of the city, was still connected to the life of Fez by these sounds and by the shared experience of the fast, and the tanner was not lonely in his solitude, but rather at peace with it, a single note in a larger harmony that stretched across the rooftops and the minarets and the narrow, winding streets. The shadows had grown long now, stretching from the base of the fig tree all the way across the yard to the far wall, and the light had deepened from gold to amber, a warm, saturated color that made the white lime pits look like pools of pale honey, and the dark stone dividers looked like bars of bronze. The tanner recognized this light as the light that came perhaps an hour before sunset, the final, beautiful phase of the day, when the world seemed to pause in appreciation of its own beauty before the darkness fell. He rose from the bench, his body moving more easily now after the long rest, and he walked to the edge of the shelter to stand in the amber light and look out over the yard. The hides were still soaking, the water was still settling, the chemistry was still working, and the tanner was still present, a quiet, patient figure in a quiet, patient landscape. The afternoon lull was ending, and the evening would soon begin. But for this one suspended moment, there was nothing that needed to be done, and nowhere that needed to be gone. Only the simple fact of standing in the golden light and breathing the lime-scented air and being exactly where he was, a tanner in his tannery, a man in his life, a soul in its moment of perfect, uncomplicated peace. The amber light deepened into a rich, burnished gold as the sun continued its slow descent toward the western hills, and the shadows that had been stretching across the yard since mid-afternoon now reached their full-length, long fingers of darkness that touched the far wall and climbed the trunk of the fig tree, and pooled in the spaces between the lime pits like dark water. The air itself seemed to change color, taking on a warm, coppery quality that made the white surfaces of the pits glow with an almost orange warmth, and the dust motes that floated in the still air caught the low-angled light and sparkled like tiny flecks of gold suspended in a slow, invisible current. The tanner stood at the edge of the shelter, his hands loose at his sides and his face turned toward the western sky, watching the transformation of the light with the quiet, patient attention of a man who had seen this same transformation thousands of times and who found in it, each time, something that could not be named but could only be felt, a resonance in the chest that was part gratitude and part peace and part something older than either. The breeze that had been wandering across the yard all afternoon now shifted direction, swinging around to come from the north where the hills rose highest and the air was always cooler in the evenings. It carried on its breath the dry, clean scent of the scrubland, the wild thyme and the warm stone, and the faint, distant hint of the cedar forests that grew on the higher slopes many miles away. The lime-scented air of the tannery stirred and mixed with this new, cooler current, and the tanner felt the first touch of evening on his cheeks and his forehead, a subtle drop in temperature that was not yet cool, but that carried the promise of the coolness to come. The reed mats above his head rustled a little more briskly, their dry stalks clicking together with a sound like the chattering of insects, and the surface of the nearest lime pit shivered as the breeze passed over it, the milky water dimpling with tiny transient ripples that caught the golden light and scattered it in shifting patterns. From the direction of the city, a sound began to rise that was different from the general murmur of the afternoon, a sound that cut through the noise of the streets and the markets and the workshops with a clarity that made everything else seem to pause. It was the voice of the muezzin, calling from the minaret of the great mosque, his chant beginning as a low, wavering note that grew in strength and volume as it ascended through the scale. The words of the sunset call to prayer floating out over the rooftops and the courtyards and the courtyards and the open ground of the tannery with a beauty that had nothing to do with music and everything to do with faith. The voice rose and fell in the long, slow cadences of the Maghrib Adhan, the call that marks the end of the day and the breaking of the fast. And the tanner stood very still as he listened, his breathing slowing and his mind emptying of all the small thoughts that had occupied it during the afternoon lull. The call to prayer was a sound that he had heard every day of his life, from his earliest memories in his father's house to the present moment in the tannery where he stood as a man of middle years, with grey beginning to show in his beard and lime permanently embedded in the creases of his hands. It was a sound that structured the day, dividing the formless flow of time into 5 distinct moments of devotion, and its familiarity did not diminish its power, but rather deepened it, the way the familiarity of the lime pits deepened his understanding of the leather. Each call was the same words spoken in the same melodic patterns, a reminder that there was no God but God, and that prayer was better than sleep, better than work, better than any worldly activity. The words washed over the tanner and through him, and he felt the long day of fasting settle into a new configuration, the discipline of the hours now preparing to give way to the relief of the evening. When the Adhan ended, the silence that followed was profound, a held breath that seemed to envelop the entire city, and then the sounds of life resumed in a different key, the noises of preparation and anticipation replacing the noises of patient endurance. The tanner did not hurry. He walked slowly to the corner of the shelter where the clay jar of fresh water sat in the shade, its porous sides cool and slightly damp to the touch from the evaporation that had been cooling its contents throughout the hot afternoon. Beside the water jar was a small alcove carved into the stone wall, and in this alcove rested his personal belongings, a folded prayer mat of woven wool, a small ceramic cup, and a leather pouch that contained dried dates, the fruit that tradition prescribed as the first food to pass the lips when the fast was broken. The pouch was made of the same goat leather that he tanned in these very pits, soft and supple, and darkened by years of handling, and he untied the drawstring with fingers that were steady and unhurried. He poured water from the clay jar into the ceramic cup, tilting the jar slowly so that the water ran in a thin, clear stream that caught the golden light and sparkled for an instant, before settling into the cup with a soft, musical sound. The water was cool, but not cold, the evaporation having kept it at a temperature that was refreshing without being shocking to the mouth, and it smelled faintly of the minerals from the deep well outside the city walls, where the water carrier filled his goatskin bags each morning. The tanner set the cup aside on the stone shelf and took a single date from the leather pouch, holding it between his thumb and forefinger and examining it in the warm light. The date was plump and dark, its skin slightly wrinkled and its surface dusted with a fine bloom of natural sugar, and it felt heavy for its size, dense with the sweetness that had been concentrated by the sun of the palm groves far to the south. This date, like all the dates that the tanner ate to break his fast, came from the oasis towns on the far side of the mountains, brought to Fez by camel caravan in great baskets woven from palm fronds, and the sweetness that it carried was the sweetness of distant places and long journeys, and the patient labor of farmers who tended the palms generation after generation. The tanner knelt on the stone floor of the shelter, facing east toward the holy city that he had never seen, but that he pictured in his mind as a place of golden light and profound peace, a place where the streets were filled with the same call to prayer that he had just heard and where the faithful gathered in numbers beyond counting. He did not unroll his prayer mat, for the stone was clean and the evening was warm, and he simply knelt where he was, his knees finding the familiar depressions in the packed earth that had been worn by countless prostrations over the years. He took up the date and held it for a moment longer, reciting the short silent prayer that his father had taught him when he was a boy, in the name of God, the most gracious, the most merciful. Then he put the date into his mouth and bit down gently, and the sweetness that flooded his tongue was so immediate and so complete that it seemed to fill not just his mouth, but his entire body, a wave of nourishment that washed through the hollow spaces where the hunger had been living all day. The date was soft and yielding, its flesh dissolving into a paste that was both sugary and slightly fibrous, and he chewed it slowly, taking his time over each small mouthful, allowing the flavor to spread across his tongue and the roof of his mouth. The fast had sharpened his senses, or perhaps it had simply cleared away the clutter of constant eating and drinking, and the taste of the date was more vivid than any taste he could remember from the ordinary days of the year. It was not just sweetness, but a complex, layered flavor that contained hints of caramel and honey, and the warm, earthy notes of the palm grove where it had grown, a flavor that spoke of sun and soil and the slow ripening of fruit over months of patient waiting. He ate the date down to the small, hard pit, which he held between his teeth for a moment, before setting it aside on the stone shelf to be discarded later. And then he reached for the cup of water with a hand that trembled very slightly, not from weakness, but from a kind of quiet emotion, a gratitude that was too deep for words. The first sip of water after a day of fasting was a sensation that the tanner had experienced hundreds of times and that never grew old or familiar, a sensation that felt like a gift each time it came. The water was cool against his dry lips, and it passed over his tongue and down his throat with a freshness that seemed to wash away the dust and the lime and the long hours of thirst in a single, clean sweep. He drank slowly, taking small sips rather than great gulps, letting each sip linger in his mouth before swallowing, and the water tasted of nothing and everything, a pure, neutral liquid that was the absence of thirst and the presence of relief. The hollow feeling in his stomach softened as the water reached it, and a warmth spread outward from his core into his limbs, a gentle, spreading comfort that made his shoulders drop and his jaw unclench in ways that he had not realized were tense. He drank half the cup and set it down, saving the rest for after the prayer, for the tradition was to break the fast with dates and water and then to pray before taking the full evening meal, a pause that allowed the body to receive the first nourishment while the spirit attended to its obligations. The light continued to deepen as he knelt on the stone floor, the gold of sunset giving way to a softer, rosier hue that painted the undersides of the few clouds in the western sky with shades of pink and coral. The lime pits, which had glowed with white intensity through the heat of the day and then with golden warmth in the late afternoon, now reflected the pink sky in their still surfaces, the milky water taking on a pale, flushed tone that was almost unearthly in its beauty, as if the basins were filled with liquid pearl rather than lime and water. The dark shapes of the submerged hides were barely visible now, obscured by the deepening twilight and the reflective surface of the water, and the whole yard seemed to rest in a state of quiet suspension, a pause between the labor of the day and the rest of the night. The tanner rose from his kneeling position and spread the prayer mat on the stone floor, the wool soft and slightly warm from the day's heat, its geometric patterns in shades of deep red and dark blue and cream. He stood facing east, his hands raised to his ears in the opening takbir, and then he entered the prayer with the same quiet, steady devotion that he brought to every aspect of his life. The movements of the prayer were as familiar as the movements of turning a hide in the lime pit. The standing, the bowing with hands on knees, the prostration with forehead touching the mat, the sitting back on the heels, and the turning of the head to the right and then to the left to offer the greeting of peace. Each position flowed into the next without haste or hesitation, a slow, rhythmic sequence that engaged the body and focused the mind and opened the heart to the presence of the divine. The tanner's lips moved in the familiar Arabic phrases, his voice a low murmur that barely carried beyond the shelter, and his mind, which had wandered through so many small thoughts during the afternoon, now settled into a still, clear focus that was its own kind of peace. When the prayer was complete, he remained kneeling on the mat for a moment longer, his hands resting on his thighs and his gaze turned inward toward a quiet, wordless gratitude that had no object and no limit, a simple thankfulness for the day that had passed, and the fast that had been kept, and the water that had quenched his thirst, and the lever that waited in the pits for the next phase of its transformation. The evening was now establishing itself in earnest, the pink fading from the sky and the first stars appearing in the east, faint pinpricks of silver against a deepening blue that would soon be black. A single bat fluttered over the yard, its flight path erratic and dipping as it chased the insects that had emerged with the cool of evening, and the tanner watched it for a moment before rising from the mat and folding it carefully, smoothing the wool with his palm and returning it to the alcove in the stone wall. He poured the remaining water from the cup and drank it in 2 slow swallows, the liquid now slightly warmer than it had been, but still cool enough to be pleasant. And then he took a second date from the leather pouch and ate it standing, looking out across the yard where the lime pits were now dark mirrors reflecting the deep blue of the evening sky. The fast was officially broken, the discipline of the day fulfilled, and his body was already beginning to absorb the simple nourishment of the dates in the water, a slow return to normal functioning that would be completed by the evening meal in a short while. But for now, in this quiet interval between the breaking of the fast and the return to the city, he was content to stand at the edge of the shelter and watch the night arrive. The sky darkening from the top down and the stars multiplying with each passing minute, the lime pits glowing faintly in the last light of the western horizon, where a thin band of pale orange still lingered above the black silhouette of the hills. The hides were resting in their baths, their turning complete for the day, their chemistry still working through the night hours when no one would watch them. A slow, invisible labor that required no supervision and no assistance. They would be there in the morning, slightly more swollen, slightly more bare of hair, slightly closer to the finished leather that they would eventually become. The tanner felt a quiet kinship with the hides in this moment, a sense that they too had fulfilled their purpose for the day and were now at rest, suspended in the milky darkness of the pits, just as he was suspended in the peaceful darkness of the evening, waiting for the next cycle to begin. He finished the second date, placed the pit beside the first one on the stone shelf, and wiped his hands on the front of his tunic, the lime residue and the date sugar mingling in a fine, pale dust that clung to the wool. The sunset call to prayer had come and gone, the fast had been broken in the quiet of the tannery, and the day was drawing to its gentle, unhurried close, leaving behind only the soft sounds of the evening and the patient, enduring peace of a man who had done his work and kept his faith, and would do the same again tomorrow. The last band of pale orange had faded from the western sky, and the world above the tannery was now a deep velvety blue that darkened toward the east, where the first stars had grown from faint pinpricks into bright, steady points of silver light. The tanner stood at the edge of the shelter for a long moment after finishing his second date, his body still and his breathing slow, feeling the cool air of evening settle around his shoulders and against the back of his neck. The day that had begun in the dark hours before dawn, that had unfolded through the grey first light and the golden morning and the white heat of midday and the amber afternoon and the pink sunset, was now drawing to its final phase, the quiet transition from dusk to full night that would send him home through the streets of the old city and deliver him to his small room and his wool blanket and the deep, dreamless sleep that always followed a day of fasting and labor. He turned from the view of the darkening yard and set about the final tasks of the day with the same unhurried, methodical care that he had brought to every other action since rising from his bed in the pre-dawn darkness. The tools that had been scattered along the walkways during the afternoon's work needed to be gathered and returned to their places in the corner of the shelter, for tools left out overnight would collect dew and develop rust on their iron parts and mildew on their wooden handles. The tanner walked slowly along the stone dividers, bending to collect the blunt scraper from where it rested near the first pit, its iron blade now cool to the touch and its olive wood handle dark with the moisture that still clung to the grain. He wiped the blade with the dry rag that hung from his belt, a square of coarse linen that he had used many times during the day, and he placed the scraper in its designated spot against the shelter wall, the handle fitting into the groove worn into the stone floor, and the blade pointing upward at a slight angle that allowed air to circulate around the metal. The hand scraper with the bone handle was retrieved from beside the goat pit, and the tanner wiped it down with particular care because the smaller tool was more susceptible to rust and because the bone handle, being porous, could absorb moisture and develop cracks if left wet. The bone felt smooth and cool under his fingers, its surface polished by generations of use, and he ran the rag along its length in long, even strokes that removed the lime water and left a faint, matte sheen. The hand scraper joined the larger scraper in the corner, and then the tanner collected the poles, the long cedarwood pole and the shorter oak pole and the delicate stick with the flattened tip, wiping each one from end to end and standing them upright in the groove where they leaned together like a bundle of fishing rods, their tips pointing toward the reed awning above. The clay pot of lime paste was already sealed and in its place, and the tanner checked the linen cover to make sure it was tied tightly, pressing down on the cloth with his thumb to test the tension of the palm fiber string. The rope of palm fiber was coiled and hung on a wooden peg driven into the shelter post, and the kneeling mat was shaken free of loose lime crust and folded and placed on the stone shelf beside the water jar. The water jar itself needed to be refilled for the next day, and the tanner lifted it with both hands, feeling the reduced weight that told him he had drunk perhaps a third of its contents over the course of the evening. He carried the jar to the far corner of the yard where a small channel had been cut into the stone wall to allow runoff from the rare rains to escape, and where a clay pipe, old and cracked but still functional, brought water from a shared well that served the tanneries and the dye works and the few houses that stood on the outskirts of the city. The water that came from this pipe was not for drinking, for it was unfiltered and slightly brackish from passing through the limestone bedrock, but it was perfectly suitable for washing tools and rinsing the stone dividers and refilling the jar that cooled the drinking water through evaporation. The tanner placed the jar under the pipe and turned the small wooden spigot that controlled the flow, and water gurgled out in a thick, uneven stream that splashed against the clay sides and made a hollow, echoing sound as the jar filled. When the water reached the brim, he closed the spigot and carried the heavy jar back to the shelter, his arms straining slightly under the weight, and his footsteps careful on the uneven stones, and he set the jar in its corner where it would be ready for the morning. The final task of the evening was the covering of the lime pits, a simple precaution that served several purposes. The reed mats that covered the pits kept out the debris that might blow across the yard during the night, the twigs and leaves and dust that the night winds sometimes carried from the scrubland, and they also slowed the evaporation of the lime water, which was important during the hot months when the level of the pits could drop noticeably between sunset and sunrise. But the main reason for covering the pits, and the reason that the tanner performed this task every evening without fail, was that the mats kept the night animals away from the soaking hides. The dogs that roamed the outskirts of the city in packs, the foxes that came down from the hills, and the occasional jackal that ventured close to the walls in search of food were all drawn by the smell of the animal skins. And while the lime water was caustic enough to discourage most of them, the mats provided an extra layer of protection that had become a tradition in the Fez tanneries over the centuries. The reed mats were stored against the back wall of the shelter, a stack of perhaps 25 rectangular panels that had been woven from the same reeds that grew along the riverbanks, their surfaces rough and their edges bound with strips of old leather to prevent fraying. Each mat was large enough to cover one pit, and they were heavy, the reeds having absorbed moisture from the air over the years until they had become dense and substantial. The tanner lifted the first mat from the stack, gripping it by the leather-bound edges and hoisting it onto his shoulder, and he carried it to the nearest pit, where the cowhide soaked beneath the dark surface of the water. He knelt at the edge of the pit and lowered the mat slowly, letting it settle across the stone rim until the basin was completely covered, the reeds making a soft, rustling sound as they adjusted to the new position, and the weight of the mat pressing down on the stone with a faint, solid thump. The mat blocked the remaining light from the sky, and the lime water beneath it was now in complete darkness, a condition that would hold until the tanner removed the mat in the morning. He repeated this process for each pit, carrying the heavy mats one by one from the shelter to the basins, kneeling to position each cover carefully so that no gaps were left at the edges, and then rising to fetch the next mat with the same slow, steady rhythm. The work was simple and repetitive, a final cycle of lifting and carrying and kneeling that echoed the turning of the hides earlier in the day, and the tanner's mind drifted into a state of calm, wordless contentment as he performed it. The stars multiplied in the darkening sky above him, the constellations that he knew by sight, but not by name, emerging from the deep blue backdrop, and a crescent moon hung low in the west, its thin curve a pale silvery sliver that was almost too delicate to be real. The evening air was cool against his skin, and the sweat that had dried on his tunic during the afternoon now made the fabric feel stiff and slightly rough, a sensation that would be remedied by the washing he would perform at home before sleep. When the last mat was in place and the entire yard had been transformed from a grid of pale, glowing basins into a dark, textured field of woven reeds, the tanner straightened and placed his hands on the small of his back, stretching the muscles that had tightened during the repeated bending. The tannery was now closed for the night, the hides safe beneath their covers, the tools stored in their corner, the water jar full, the lime paste sealed, the poles wiped and standing at attention. Nothing remained to be done, and the quiet satisfaction of completion settled over the tanner, like the reed mats settling over the pits. A covering of peace that marked the end of the working day and the beginning of the hours of rest. He walked to the shelter and retrieved his small brass lamp from the stone shelf, the same lamp he had carried through the dark streets in the pre-dawn hours of the morning. The wick was still long enough to burn for the walk home, and he trimmed it with his thumbnail as he had done before, then struck a spark from his flint and held it to the oil-soaked cord until the flame caught and steadied. The light was small and yellow and intimate, a warm glow that pushed back the darkness just far enough to illuminate his face and his hands, and the immediate circle of ground around his feet. He lifted the lamp by its worn brass handle and carried it to the gap in the low stone wall where the wooden gate had once hung. The same gap he had stepped through in the darkness of the early morning when the stars were still bright and the city was still asleep. Now the city was awake, or at least in its evening state of quiet activity, and the sounds that drifted from the direction of the streets were different from the sounds of the morning. The smell of cooking fires had replaced the smell of cold ash, and the murmur of voices was the murmur of families gathering for the evening meal, rather than the murmur of commerce and labor. The tanner stepped through the gap and began the walk home, his lamp swinging gently with the motion of his arm, and the flame casting a wobbling circle of light on the gravel and crushed limestone of the path. The ground sloped gently upward as he left the outskirts and entered the narrow alleys of the Medina, the same alleys he had walked in the darkness many hours before, but now the character of the streets was entirely different. The doors that had been closed and shuttered in the pre-dawn stillness were now open, spitting warm yellow light from oil lamps and candles into the narrow passageways, and the tanner caught glimpses of the courtyards beyond, the potted plants and the tiled fountains and the dialed fountains and the rugs spread on the flagstones where families sat in circles eating their evening meals. The smell of harira drifted from every doorway, the thick, fragrant soup of tomatoes and lentils and chickpeas that was the traditional dish for breaking the fast, and the tanner's stomach responded with a soft, pleasant hunger that was entirely different from the sharp, dry hunger of the afternoon. A hunger that would soon be satisfied rather than denied. He passed the covered passage near the great mosque, and the smell of old books and incense that had clung to the stonework in the morning was now overlaid with the scent of the food being prepared in the houses that surrounded the courtyard. The fountain in the center of the courtyard caught the light of the lamps that had been lit around its perimeter, the water sparkling in 1,000 small reflections that danced on the surface and on the surrounding tiles, and a group of men sat on the stone benches around the fountain, talking quietly as they waited for the call to the night prayer. The tanner did not stop to join them, for he was not a man who sought conversation after a long day of solitude, but he nodded in acknowledgement as he passed, and one or two of the men nodded back, recognizing the tanner from his daily walks through the neighborhood. The shops that had been shuttered in the morning were now open in the evening, their owners taking advantage of the cooler hours to conduct business before the final prayer of the night. The date seller had arranged his baskets in a pyramid at the front of his stall, and the dried fruits gleamed darkly in the lamplight, their sugary surfaces catching the glow. The weaver's workshop was lit from within, and the tanner could see the loom standing against the wall, its warp threads stretching upward like the strings of a harp, though the weaver himself was not at work but sitting on a stool eating from a clay bowl. The blacksmith's forge was dark and cold, its fire banked for the night, but the coppersmith next door was still tapping away at a tray, the small, precise hammer blows ringing out into the evening air with a bell-like clarity that echoed down the alley. Every door and every window told a story of the evening routines of the people who lived and worked in this quarter of the city, and the tanner absorbed these stories without prying or staring, simply noting the presence of his neighbors and feeling a quiet sense of belonging to the larger fabric of the Medina. A cat crossed his path, not the grey cat from the tannery, but a smaller black cat with white paws that moved with the silent, fluid grace of its kind, and it paused in the circle of his lamplight to look up at him with eyes that glowed green and gold in the dark. The cat held his gaze for a moment, then continued on its way, disappearing into a narrow gap between two houses where no human could follow. The tanner smiled slightly, the first expression that had crossed his face in hours, and then he resumed his walk, the smile fading into the same calm, neutral expression that he wore throughout the day. The alley widened into the small square where the date sellers set up their stalls, and now the square was transformed from the empty, shadowed space of the morning into a lively gathering place where neighbors sat on wooden crates and shared tea and exchanged the news of the day. A man with a tray of small glasses passed among them, pouring the hot mint tea from a height so that the liquid caught the air and formed a thin layer of foam on top of each glass, and the sweet, herbal scent of the tea mingled with the smoke of the oil lamps and the distant smell of incense from the mosque. Children ran between the legs of the adults, their energy undimmed by the long day of fasting, and their laughter was high and bright and unself-conscious, the sound of a world that was safe and familiar and loved. The tanner walked around the edge of the square rather than through its center, not out of any desire to avoid the gathering, but out of a habit of quietness that made him prefer the shadows to the lamplight, and he continued on his way without interrupting the scene. The final stretch of the journey took him past the smith's forge and the weaver's workshop and the small doorways with their iron-studded faces, until he reached the narrow alley that led to his own house. The walls here were the same tawny earth as the rest of the Medina, and the ground underfoot was the same packed dirt, strewn with bits of straw, and the strip of sky visible between the overhanging upper stories was now completely dark, scattered with more stars than the tanner could count. The door to his house was exactly as he had left it in the darkness of the morning, the rough wood and the iron latch and the small square window above the lintel, and he lifted the latch with the same familiar motion and pushed the door inward, stepping into the small courtyard where the potted mint plant was now a dark silhouette against the starlight, and the stone basin held the water he had drawn the evening before. The tanner closed the door behind him with a soft, solid sound that separated the quiet of his home from the quiet of the street, and he placed the lamp on the stone shelf beside the door where it would be ready for the next morning. He performed the ritual washing as he had done before the dawn prayer, pouring the cool water over his hands and forearms and face and feet, and the water washed away the last traces of lime dust and sweat and the long residue of the working day. The sensation of cleanliness was deeply satisfying, a physical renewal that matched the spiritual renewal of the evening prayer, and he stood for a moment in the dark courtyard feeling the water evaporate from his skin and the cool air move across his body. In his small room, the wooden chest and the low stool and the mattress, stuffed with dried palm fibers, were exactly as he had left them, untouched and patient, and he removed his tunic and hung it on a peg driven into the earthen wall where the air could circulate and dry the remaining moisture. He broke a piece of bread from the loaf that had been left for him by the neighbor woman who checked on the house during the day, and he ate it slowly, not because he was still hungry, but because the act of eating was a quiet pleasure after the long fast, and he drank a cup of water from the small earthen jar that stood beside his bed. The bread was soft and slightly warm from the day's heat, and it tasted of the semina flour and the communal oven, and the hands that had kneaded the dough in the hours before dawn, a taste that was as familiar as the smell of the lime pits and as comforting as the weight of the wool blanket. He lay down on the mattress, feeling the palm fibers shift beneath him to accommodate the shape of his body, and he pulled the blanket up to his chest and closed his eyes. The sounds of the city at night were softer than the sounds of the day, a distant, murmuring lullaby that rose and fell without pattern, the call of the muezzin for the final prayer of the night, the barking of a dog near the river, the slow creak of a cartwheel, and then the gradual deepening of the silence as the city settled into sleep. The tanner's body was heavy with the good tiredness of a day spent in patient labor, and his mind was empty and calm, the small events of the day already fading into a soft, indistinct haze that would dissolve completely by morning. The hides were soaking in their dark pits under their reed mats on the outskirts of the city, the chemistry of lime and leather continuing its silent work through the night, and the tanner was resting in his small room in the heart of the Medina, a man at peace with his work and his faith and his place in the long, slow rhythm of the days that had come before, and the days that would come after. The last thought that drifted through his mind before sleep took him was the thought of the morning, when he would wake in the darkness and light his lamp and walk the quiet streets again, beginning the same cycle with the same patience and the same quiet purpose, for the work was never finished, and the leather was always waiting, and the tanner was always waiting, and the tanner was always ready to begin again.